Hey everybody, in today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about your star tracker. Before we get to that though, I just have a few points I need to clarify. First, these videos were recorded back in 2020 as part of my star tracker series. And while 95% of the information should still be accurate, there might be a few things here and there that could use updating. And I realize a lot of people have moved on from star trackers, myself included, but I have been getting more requests about this stuff lately, so I wanted to put this up for free on YouTube and help you out if you're still struggling. If you are still struggling, I do have a Deep Space course and Milky Way course, which have both been updated within the last year or two. Those go into a ton more detail, especially on the processing. So if you make it through all this and you still have questions, you might want to check that out. The final thing I want to mention is that, as you can tell from the runtime of the video, we've got a lot to cover. That's just the way these star trackers are. They're very finicky to use, and there's a lot of added complexity to the setup process. So if you find yourself really struggling and getting frustrated, I know it happens to a lot of people, myself included, then you might want to consider upgrading the mount to something like ZWO's AM5 or even the AM3. These were not around back in 2020, and if they were, that's what I would have been using, because they're almost the same size as a star tracker, but you don't have to worry about a polar scope or balancing a counterweight or manually finding your targets. So it makes your night much easier. And that's what I cover in some of my newer YouTube videos, as well as the Deep Space course. Now I realize those mounts are quite a bit more expensive, but like I said, if you're getting really fed up with this stuff, it might be well worth the money. Anyway, today we're here to talk about star trackers, so without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to the On Location segment for the Star Adventurer. Now, throughout this section of the course, I'm going to show you how to use every single aspect of the Star Adventurer. But today we're just going to focus on the basics, because even if you've had your star tracker for a couple months or maybe even a year or longer, there might be still a few little tricks you'll learn in this video. First, let's start with the tracker itself. I'll take it off the base here. And to be honest, one of the biggest problems I have with this tracker, and you're probably going to encounter this as well, is we have this dovetail plate that we're going to attach to the bottom of the Star Adventurer. You should have already done that. If not, now is the time to do it. You're just going to screw it in, and the thumb screw up here is going to be facing towards the front of the tracker. Now, one of the problems you're going to have is that eventually this piece is going to work itself loose from the tracker, and that's going to mean that the whole thing is going to rock left and right, and that can really ruin your night. So I'd always recommend you do, before you head out for the night, is to get a screwdriver and really tighten down this big screw, and also verify the thumb screw is nice and snug. That way you lessen your chances of having any serious problems. So that's our dovetail plate. That's what allows us to attach this to our base and have a secure connection, most of the time anyway, and that's one of the most critical components that you might overlook. Next up, we have the tracking speeds, and I'm sure you've all seen those by now. They're going to be here on this rotary dial on the side. And by default, obviously you want to leave this turned off. If you were to leave it turned on, that could cause a myriad of problems. You might have, of course, the batteries die out on you. But more importantly, if this is running on like 12x or something in your case and you don't know about it, this whole front piece is slowly going to be turning. So what's going to happen if you have this, stuck up against something and it can't turn? You might burn out the motor, or at the very least it's going to stall, and you're going to have problems. So one thing I recommend is to prevent any accidental turn on of the star tracker. If we take off the battery cover here, just pull out one of the AA's, and that way it can't turn on no matter what. The only thing with that is you got to remember where you put that AA and make sure you actually have it on you. That way when you get there on location, you're not out of luck. But that's just one little trick I'd point you to, is that I never have all 4 AA's in here, just because this could really screw you up, and it's very easy to do where the tracker gets turned on accidentally. So just have a spare 4th AA battery in your case that you can install right before you begin shooting, and don't forget to put it in, because obviously that won't work either. Now, that's our tracking speeds, but let's get into what each one does. First, we have the star icon. That is the sidereal tracking speed, 1x, speed of the stars, whatever. But that's what you're going to want to be on probably 90% of the time if you want to photograph deep space objects or the Milky Way or anything else. So that's our star tracking speed. Next up, we have the solar tracking speed. Obviously, that's going to allow you to photograph the sun. And really, the main and really only time I would use this is if I was doing a solar eclipse photo shoot. Because if you're on the solar tracking speed and you do a rough polar alignment during the day, Now the tracker is going to help your camera keep the sun centered up in the frame over the course of a few hours. If you didn't have the star tracker, you'd be constantly moving your camera to follow the motion of the sun. So that's one of the nice things with the tracker, is it'll just keep it centered up in the frame during the course of your eclipse photo shoot. Moving down, we have the moon tracking speed. It's pretty much the same thing as the sun, where it's going to keep that moon centered up in the frame. That way, if you want to take a ton of photos, you can do that. But the moon is so bright, like the sun, that you really don't need to use a star tracker for moon photography. You could probably shoot 1/200th of a second during a full moon, so there's really no need for it. Again, the main reason I'd use the lunar tracking speed is just so it keeps it centered up in the frame and I'm not constantly readjusting the camera and lens on a tripod. Next up, we have half speed. This is not really useful, to be honest, because you're going to be moving slower than the stars, which means you're going to get star trails. And you're also still moving, so your foreground's going to blur out. So if anything, this is like the worst of both worlds. And I think they just include this so you could shoot a little bit longer than your 15 or 20 second long exposure and still have reasonably sharp stars and a reasonably sharp foreground. Let's say 30, 45, up to a minute long with a wide angle lens. But again, realistically, we're not going to use that really ever. Next up, we have 2x, 4x, or rather 6x, and 12x. These are going to be used if you want to do any time-lapse photography. And we'll have a full separate video dedicated to time-lapses, but basically if you want this thing to move a lot faster, you can put it to 2x, 6x, or 12x, and then this front piece here is just going to really start to turn much more fast than normal. And that'll give you a panning motion, either left to right, right to left. But again, we'll cover that in a full video on time-lapses. And that's all of our different tracking speeds here with our dial. Again, leave it turned off, take out the battery just to make sure it doesn't turn itself on, and almost all the time you just want to put it to the star icon, you'll be good to go there. Those are our different tracking speeds for the Star Adventurer. Let's continue on with the star tracker itself, and on the opposite side, we've got our hemisphere toggle and a couple different inputs. So for most of us, we're going to be in the northern hemisphere, I'm assuming, so make sure this is set to the N for northern hemisphere. If you leave it set in the middle, that'll be the time-lapse option, which we're not really going to do too much of. And then we have S if you're in the southern hemisphere. And all this really does is it changes the direction that this piece rotates. And that'll come in handy if you're doing time lapses too, because maybe you want to have it turn in one direction. You can adjust that by switching it from N to S. But again, we'll cover that in another video. We also have two arrows right here. These are our slewing buttons mainly. And if you're guiding, they'll flash red to indicate that there's some communication there. But really what I would use these two arrows for is if you are doing deep space astrophotography with a very telephoto lens like 500-600 millimeters, and it's not quite centered up in the frame, whatever you're photographing. If you hold down this arrow or this arrow for a few seconds, it will move the object in the frame. It's really just going to depend on how everything's oriented, how the object will move. But this is an easy way to move things around. It goes very slowly, so it's not that useful. But again, essentially what these arrows are doing is moving this piece either one way or the other, just very, very slowly. That's all they're doing there for the slewing arrows up top. Moving down, we have a snap cable input. This is like a little 3.5 millimeter jack that could connect your DSLR to the star tracker. And the reason you would do that is if you're doing time lapses, you can have it set up so this will actually send a command to your camera to take a photo. But for most of us, it's not very useful, and you'd be better off just controlling your camera manually. So I almost never use the snap cable on the Star Adventurer. And then below that, we have an auto guiding port and a DC 5-volt port. So if you have an auto guider, you can plug that in right here, and that's going to make the star tracker run much more accurately at telephoto focal lengths. So if you do plan to shoot at 400 millimeters or higher fairly frequently, I'd recommend looking at the auto guider videos in the course because that can really help you out. But if you're just going to be shooting 200 millimeters and less, you really don't need to worry about an auto guider. It's going to be overkill for most of you. And then finally, we have that DC 12-volt input, or 5-volt input here, down here. That will power the Star Adventurer. So if you don't have AA batteries with you, or you don't like dealing with them, I know I personally don't, you could get the proper USB cable and connect this to like a little portable cell phone charger, power bank, something like that. And that will power the Star Adventurer rather than using the AA's. So for some of you, that might be a better option. Realistically, I would just use this in an emergency. If all my batteries died, I probably have a cell phone battery charger that I could plug in, although to be honest, I don't have this specific USB cable, so I'd be out of luck. But if you did get this one, that's what that would do for you. So that's the basics of the unit. If we take off this back cap, we have our polar scope, and this is one of the most critical components of the Star Adventurer. So I'd recommend you take off all your plugs and caps and look through the polar scope. When you look through here, if you're looking out during the day, you might notice that everything is upside down. That's totally normal. When we look through our polar scope, it's always going to be inverted. And that's good to know, because if you're out there at night and you're making adjustments and you're like, why is this not going the way I want it to? It's because everything in here is upside down. So bear that in mind. Another important aspect of the polar scope is that there's a reticle inside of there with 0, 3, 6, and 9. That's going to be useful for our polar alignment. So what I want you to do is loosen the clutch. That's these black knobs here on the front of the Star Tracker. If you push them down, or rather up, I still get confused. I've been doing this for years, so don't get discouraged if you are in the same boat. Anyway, if we push the clutch upwards, that will loosen it. Now when we look through the polar scope, we can grab a hold of this big screw here on the front and just turn it one way or the other while we're looking through the scope, and you'll notice that the reticle moves around. What I'd like you to do is get it so 0, 3, 6, and 9 are lined up like a clock. In my case, it's right at this angle. Then we can tighten down the clutch. And when we're doing our polar alignment, we want to make sure that all the numbers are lined up to make our life a little bit easier. And we'll cover that, of course, in the relevant videos. For those of you in the southern hemisphere, you're going to see the octans circles over on the left in this case. Those are going to line up to the sigma octan stars in the southern hemisphere sky. They're going to be very small, probably hard to see, but that's how you're going to do your polar alignment, is using those stars. Whereas those of us in the northern hemisphere, we're going to put Polaris somewhere on that circle where we have 0, 3, 6, and 9. So there's two different methods, but again, we'll get into that more in some future videos. I just wanted you to be aware of what's going on there inside of the polar scope. One of the most common questions I get about this, and to be honest, I still get confused by it, are these dials here on the back near your polar scope. These are, as far as I can tell, designed to be used for a manual polar alignment if you didn't have a smartphone. So if, who knows, maybe you broke your cell phone or something, you're just completely out of luck, that would be the only time I would ever even consider using these circles. And if you read the instruction manual, it's really vague, but basically you have to line up the day, month, year, and time and everything. And when you do that, the polar scope should rotate. It's all very confusing. So what I want to make sure I'm clear on is that you don't need to worry about these dials. For all of us, we don't even need to touch them, and we could still do our polar alignment using a smartphone app. So they're not really of any use. No other star tracker on the market has them. I don't know why they include them on this one, but they really don't serve any function for most of us. So that's the Star Adventurer. Now let's take a look at the base. This is our latitude base, or the wedge. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's all the same thing. The first point I want to make about the latitude base is that it's connected directly to my tripod. You'll notice there's no center column, because that's the number one problem that people have when they're trying to do a polar alignment or use the Star Adventurer in general, is that they have a tripod with a center column. And therefore, when they go to tighten down the base, no matter how hard they turn it, things still move left and right, and you'll never be able to get an accurate polar alignment because of it. And this is something we talked about in the gear section of the course, but I highly recommend investing in a sturdy tripod that has no center column. That's going to give you by far the best results, and I guarantee it'll make your night a lot easier compared to a little thin carbon fiber tripod with a center column that goes up and down. That's going to cause you no end of trouble, as many of my students can attest to. So again, no center column. We just take the base, screw it right on like so. And when you tighten this down, I want you to really tighten it down, because if this comes loose, like I said, it's going to ruin everything. So verify it's nice and snug. There's also a bubble level on here. In my case, I'm looking level. But if you had some issues where you were having a hard time getting it level, you can use that. I want to stress here though, that you don't have to get super worked up about getting everything completely level. My whole thing is, as long as it's not like tilted at some weird angle, your legs and all that, you'll be okay. Some people go to a lot of extremes. They have like a leveling base attached and then this attached. You don't need to do all that. If anything, the more pieces you have between your tripod and your base, the more points of failure. So I always like to get them directly connected to one another and just keep all that stuff in mind. So the way the base works is you need to figure out your latitude. And the easiest way to do that is use a smartphone app. You can use, there's so many. Probably the easiest for everybody is the Star Adventurer Mini Console app. We're going to be using this for our polar alignment as well. And when you load up the Star Adventurer Mini Console app, you can go to the Polar Clock utility, and in the upper right, you're going to see location. If you click on that, it should pull in your current latitude and longitude, regardless if you have a cell phone connection or not. More often than not, I'm out there in the middle of nowhere with no reception, and I'm still able to get my GPS data. So you don't have to worry about being in an area with reception for that. So once you know that number for your latitude, you're going to dial that in here on the base with these corresponding numbers. In my case, I'm in about 37 degrees north, so I can just adjust the big knob here on the front. This is our altitude knob to get it as close as I can to 37. And one thing that some people do is they loosen the lock here, like so. That makes this much easier to turn, but you don't need to do that. I almost always have this thing locked down as tight as possible, and I can still make small, precise adjustments on my altitude knob. So I recommend you leave that tightened down, because if you loosen it, things can jostle more than you'd like. But that's what these numbers correspond to, is your latitude, whether you're north or south, and you're going to adjust the knob here to get it fairly close. That's going to angle up your star tracker to the spot in the sky where all the stars rotate around. And that is our altitude. So we've got altitude, and we've also got, on the other side, our azimuth screws. So we've got the altitude knob that kind of moves things up and down, and our azimuth screws, these move things left and right. The whole reason we even mess around with these is for our polar alignment. So we're going to talk about that more in the upcoming videos. But the way these azimuth screws work is you're going to turn them both at the same direction at the same time. As you turn them both in the same direction at the same time, it's going to move things very slightly left and right. That's going to allow you to move Polaris inside of the polar scope. So those are the azimuth screws. And speaking of the azimuth screws, you should notice two little screws here on either side of the base, and you would need like a little hex key set to tighten those down. You want to make sure those are snug. If these two screws here on the top sides of the base are loose, then the whole base could shift left and right at any time, and again, that will cause problems. So get a hex key and tighten both of these down so they're snug. You don't want them overly tightened, just snug. And there we go. Another point I want to make about these azimuth screws is that after you've done your polar alignment, I like to turn them in opposite directions. So I'll turn one away from me and one towards me until they stop turning. That locks down the base completely, so there's no way for it to move. If you just left these kind of loose like this, then it's possible that things would shift slightly left and right. So just make sure after you've done your polar alignment, you tighten these down by turning them in the opposite directions. We'll cover all this in the polar alignment videos as well. This is just the basics today. And that's really all there is to the base. We have our altitude adjustment knob, our azimuth adjustment screws, and the whole reason we're using those is to get our polar alignment dialed in accurately. There's just a few more things I want to touch on in this video, and then we'll call it a day. Hopefully you learned at least one little trick today. So I'm going to reattach now my tracker to the base. And you probably got, if you got the Pro Pack, which is what I recommend, you should have gotten this little green piece here. This is our ball head mounting screw. What you're going to do is just slide this on the front, tighten down this screw, and then from here you can attach a ball head. And I don't see one lying around, but I'm sure you can visualize. Just screw on a ball head here, and then after you've screwed on a ball head, you can attach your camera and aim up anywhere you'd like. We'll cover that in the wide angle tutorial. So this is going to be the easiest option if you just want to do Milky Way photography. And as long as you don't have a really huge camera with a battery grip and a really big heavy lens, this is going to work fine. So for those of you with a D850 with a battery grip or like a D6 or something like that and a 14-24 f2.8 lens, you might actually want to try a different technique. But for probably 90% of us, as long as you've got a pretty compact ball head and a fairly moderately weighted camera, like even my D750 or D780 with a big lens, that's still going to work fine. It's just for those people with awfully large cameras. Anyway, this is our ball head mounting piece. That's what you're going to want to use for Milky Way photography. But if you're going to be doing deep space astrophotography, whether that's nebula or galaxies, you're going to want to use the declination bracket counterweight kit, which we see here. You'll notice I screwed in the rod to the green piece. I've attached the counterweight. And the way this works is we're just going to slide this down fairly low as well. Because if we have this tightened down way up here, you have such a high center of gravity now that this little counterweight's never going to be enough to balance it. It's going to be too heavy up here. So by lowering everything, probably about that low, now you have a much lower center of gravity. This counterweight's going to work a lot better for you. And we'll cover that more in the counterweight balancing video. I just wanted to show you the basics today. So what you would do in this case is you'd grab your telephoto lens, screw it onto here, and then you could aim up anywhere in the night sky. And we'll cover this in the telephoto video. But this is the declination bracket. You're going to use that for deep space work. That's kind of what you would want to use for that. And the only thing left that I can think of is this junky little red light illuminator. The way this works is you like clip it in here, you turn the thing on, and then it's supposed to illuminate that reticle so you can see it in the dark. There's also, now this is mainly the PCR. The problem with this is that it's very flimsy. It's a pain to use. More than likely you're going to lose it at some point. And I don't recommend using this to illuminate your reticle. What you're better off doing is just using a headlamp you already have. So let me put all this down, grab my headlamp, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so I've got my headlamp. If I turn it on to the red light there, what I normally do is I just look through the scope, flash this over the front briefly to see the reticle and see where Polaris is at on the reticle. And this is going to replace this junky little poorly designed red light illuminator. So you don't need this, you don't need to worry about it. Just use your headlamp. It's going to make things a lot easier. And we'll get into that more in the various tutorials. So that's the basics of the Star Adventurer. We've covered almost everything you need to know about the unit itself. And if there's any other questions you have, they're surely going to get answered in the following videos. So hopefully you learned something today. And next we'll talk about doing a polar alignment with the Star Adventurer. To get the best results out of your Star Adventurer, you need to do an accurate polar alignment every single night. And this is something that's going to take a lot of practice. I mean, to be honest, it took me years to really get the hang of it. And for the first year, I didn't even have a focused polar scope. So I was just having a heck of a time. Now though, that I've been doing this for probably 3 years, I could do my polar alignment in 30 seconds or less on any night. So I'm going to show you some of my techniques today that are going to make your life a lot easier. First, let's talk about the polar scope itself here on our Star Adventurer. The first thing you want to do when you get your tracker, one of the first things, is get this thing focused. So there's going to be a little dial here on the back of your polar scope that will change the focus. I'd recommend you look through here right now, out a window or something. And if things are completely blurry, then you can just turn this left and right, one way or the other, until things look a little bit sharper. One thing that might really help you out though, is to do this during the full moon, or any kind of moon really, because the moon's going to be very easy to find in the sky, and that'll be the perfect thing to focus on. It's big and it's bright. So that's what I'd recommend. And if you're having a hard time holding it up like that, you could always just put it here on the base, tighten it down, and then reposition the base and the altitude knob to line up to the moon or whatever it is you want to focus on. But that's one of the most important things with the polar scope right out of the gate. Don't make the mistake I did where I waited probably 6 months to actually get this thing focused. And once you have the polar scope focused, then we can talk about how to do our polar alignment. I should also mention that this video is for those of you in the northern hemisphere, because if you're in the northern or the southern hemisphere, things change quite a bit. If you are in the southern hemisphere, you can skip this one and go watch the following video. Okay, so what we want to do now that we've got the polar scope focused is talk about how to find Polaris. This is the North Star. And if you were to stare at the North Star all night long, you would realize that compared to every other star in the night sky, it doesn't appear to move. If you've ever done any star trails, you've seen this effect if you face north, where we have that beautiful circular motion. Now, really what we're trying to do with our star tracker is not pointed at Polaris, but the North Celestial Pole. That's this little blank spot in the sky nearby where all the stars actually rotate around. And if you were to look through your polar scope right now, you're going to see a circle with a crosshair in the middle. Really what we're trying to do is get that crosshair centered up on the North Celestial Pole. And Polaris is going to sit on that circle around in our reticle. That's really what we're trying to do. The more accurate our polar alignment is, the longer we can shoot without star trails, and that's especially important with a telephoto lens. Now that we've talked about really what we're trying to do, again, let's get back to how to find Polaris. So for me, the easiest way is to use the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper is always going to be somewhere in the northern sky, regardless of the time of day or the time of year. It just might be in a different orientation, so that might throw you off. But if you see the Big Dipper, it's a big, iconic cluster of stars, then you can take this specific corner star. It's going to be the same one no matter the orientation, but we're going to take this corner star and draw kind of a straight line out. That will take you to Polaris. And contrary to popular belief, Polaris is not the biggest and brightest star in the northern sky. It is fairly bright, it is fairly large, but it's not the biggest and brightest. So don't get confused by that. If you're still having trouble finding Polaris, that's where a smartphone app might come in handy. I like to use Stellarium, but you can use whatever app you're comfortable with. In my case, when I load up Stellarium, one thing that really helps me out is to click the 6 boxes in the lower left. And then if you click this icon right here, that'll bring up the grid, and that'll help you figure out where the North Star is actually at. So there we go. Another useful technique is if you click the little phone icon right here, it looks like it has wings almost, and hold your phone up, you'll be able to see where you're aimed at. So if you're really confused, that might help you out. But in my case, my phone magnet is busted, so it's always telling me I'm facing south. Make sure that doesn't happen to you. But that's one thing that could help you out, is using a smartphone app. Anyway, once you find Polaris, now what we want to do is pick up our tripod and move it left and right until we're aimed up at Polaris. For this demo, I'm going to pretend it's right over the camera just so you can see things better. So I'm going to crouch down, pick up my tripod, move it. I'm looking over the top of the tracker, and I want to get Polaris centered over the top, right about there. Then I'll extend my legs fully. That way there's no accidents later on in the night. Push down on all my tripod legs so they're not going anywhere. If one of the legs collapses, extend it, tighten down the ring, and there we go. We've now got our star tracker facing up towards Polaris. That's the easy part done, but it's also going to be kind of difficult your first few nights out there, so don't get discouraged if you just got your Star Adventurer. Now that we've got Polaris over the top of our star tracker, let's make sure that our tripod and our base are fairly level. We've got our bubble level right here. I'm looking pretty good. In your case, if you're a little bit off, you can adjust your legs to get it back where it needs to be, but don't get too worked up about it. As long as it's pretty close, I don't care. Again, the big thing is that your legs are fully extended. That's more important than anything. Because if you have a leg that's not fully extended and you don't catch it, this whole thing could tip over and you're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's my big thing. There we go. All right, at this point, we need to use a smartphone app. That way we figure out where to position Polaris in our scope. What I'd recommend everybody do, regardless of your platform, is to get the Star Adventurer Mini console app, also known as the SAM console app. Should be a free download. Once you install this application, you can click on Polar Clock Utility. You'll now see the reticle, our polar scope right there. And there should be a gray little dot. It's probably hard to see for a lot of you, but if you stare at the scope long enough, you'll see a gray little dot there. That's where we need to position Polaris inside of here. If it's not updating, make sure you click Location in the top right and verify that it is using your location sensor. That way it's pulling in your correct location. While we're on there too, another really important tip is that we enter our latitude here on the base. So again, we're here on our location and I'm at 37 degrees north. So I'm going to come here on my base and turn this until I'm about 37. It's kind of hard to get it perfect, just get it fairly close. That's going to be good enough. But now that we've got our latitude dialed into the base, I see that Polaris needs to be at about 11:15 roughly on the clock. So what we want to do is loosen our clutch here, turn this big old screw left and right while we're looking through the scope. And if you're doing this in the middle of the night, you're probably not going to see the reticle. So that's where we're going to grab our red headlamp light and flash it over the front while we're looking through here until we can see the reticle and it's lined up, just like we see in our application 0, 3, 6, and 9. Now comes the challenging part. We've got all the setup figured out, but we actually need to find Polaris now in our scope. For a lot of you, this is going to be very difficult, especially if you don't have the best eyes or if you're having trouble getting this thing focused. And this is something that took me, 10, 15 minutes, if not longer, when I was first getting started. My very first night, it took me over an hour to do a polar alignment. Now, I can do one in 30 seconds flat, no problem. Let me show you how I do that. It's actually very simple. I'm gonna look through my polar scope, look back over the top of the tracker, make sure I'm aimed up at Polaris, pick up the tripod while I'm looking through the scope, and just move it left and right like this. As you're moving it left and right, maybe even up and down very slightly, you're gonna see a big bright star drift into the field of view. That is Polaris. Whether you're in a very dark sky or a light polluted sky, you're gonna see a bigger, brighter star than anything else when you're looking through the scope. That's always gonna be Polaris, unless a plane's flying through or something. So that's how I do my polar alignment in 30 seconds, is this technique right here. Really all I'm doing is picking up the tripod, moving it left and right until I see a big bright star. That's almost always gonna be Polaris. And then the trick is lowering the tripod while I keep the North Star in the field of view, and also making sure that my tripod legs didn't collapse. I need them to be fully extended. There we go. Hopefully now, when your tripod is securely put on the ground, the legs are extended, Polaris did not drift out of the frame. If it did, try that one more time, and there we go. As long as it's somewhere in the frame, I'm happy. We've now just done at least a rough polar alignment using that method. Now that we have Polaris somewhere inside of our polar scope, we can grab our red headlamp again, flash it over the front, and see where it is in relation to our reticle. If you're kind of confused right now, don't forget to check your SAM console app on your smartphone and see where Polaris needs to be. Again, it's going to be somewhere on that circle. So now that you know that position, you need to get it there. The way you're going to do that is you're going to use your altitude knob here to move Polaris up and down. Just turn it one way while you're looking through here. See which way Polaris moves. If it's going the wrong way, just turn the knob the other way. Get it fairly close in terms of the up-down. Once you've got that there, then we can use our azimuth screws here. Remember, we're going to turn these both in the same direction at the same time, and that's going to have the effect of moving Polaris left and right. So again, we'll look through the scope, turn it left and right. You're not really going to be able to see the reticle, so just make some adjustments. Grab your headlamp, flash it over the front, say, okay, I'm not quite there yet. Make some more adjustments, flash it over. Just keep doing that. It's not very hard, and once you get it fairly close, the closer the better, you've now done your polar alignment. As you see, with that trick where we just pick up the whole tripod and move it left and right, make some small adjustments, you shouldn't have too much trouble doing this. And I'd recommend you go out on even a partly cloudy night, as long as this portion of the sky is clear, and practice. The more you practice looking through this polar scope, the easier it's going to get. And eventually, if you do it enough like me, you'll be able to do it in 30 seconds or less, guaranteed. Before we go, there's just a few final points I want to touch on. If you're going to be shooting with a wide angle lens, like 14 to 35 millimeters, you don't have to sit here for an hour and get it perfectly lined up. As long as, to be honest, as long as the North Star is somewhere in the field of view here, that's probably good enough to shoot even 2 minutes at 14 millimeters. The closer you get though, I mean, if you get it fairly close, you could probably shoot 5, 6, 7 minutes at 14 and 24 millimeters and still have sharp stars. So with a wide angle lens, it's very forgiving. As you increase your focal length though, to 100 millimeters or 200 millimeters or higher, this thing has got to be super accurate. And that brings me to another problem. We've just done our polar alignment with nothing attached to the front. That makes things a lot easier. However, when you attach a wide angle lens and a ball head, that will throw off the alignment a little bit, but you won't know because it's going to be covering up the polar scope hole. So what I'm telling you is that if you're shooting with a wide angle lens and a ball head and all that, when you attach things, it's going to throw off your alignment anyway. So that's just one more reason why I don't want you to sit here and spend an hour doing your polar alignment, because it's going to get thrown off. However, if you're using a telephoto lens and the declination bracket, you'll have a little slot cut out through the middle. You'll be able to double check your polar alignment after you've attached all your gear. And that's something we're going to focus on in the telephoto video. So I'd recommend you go watch that one if you do want to do some deep space astrophotography. And my whole point of bringing this up is that if you are doing telephoto work, you will want to double check the polar alignment before you begin shooting, because more than likely it will get thrown off. But today we've just covered the basics of doing a polar alignment. Just a very quick recap: find north, find Polaris, and the way I like to do that is with the Big Dipper. Take the corner star, draw a straight line out, that's Polaris. Then I grab the tripod, move it left and right until I see Polaris kind of centered up over the top of it. Once I'm pretty close, I extend all my tripod legs, push down, make sure they're not going anywhere, and verify I'm fairly flat on my bubble level. Once I've done that, now I'm actually going to pick up the tripod while I'm looking through the scope and move it left and right until I see Polaris come into the frame. Then I want to very gently put the tripod down. Then from here, do your azimuth and altitude adjustments until Polaris matches what we see in the SAM console app. And don't forget to use your red headlamp to see the reticle. And that's how you're going to do a polar alignment with the Star Adventurer. Pretty easy to do, right? Now I know when you get out there you're going to have a lot more trouble than I made it seem today. That's normal, but the more you practice, the easier it'll get. And like I said, if you can just keep plugging away at it, within a couple months, hopefully, now I've shown you my recommended techniques I've learned over the years, you should be able to get this done in 5 minutes or less. And that's all I got for you today. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Today we're going to look at how to balance the counterweight on your Star Adventurer. Now if you follow me on YouTube, you know that this is a very touchy subject for me. So about a month ago I was trying to record this video out in the mountains, and in the process of recording that I dropped my camera and lens, and it took a month for them to get repaired. It cost me a couple $100, and in the process, I actually just got these back yesterday. They look brand new, so that's one of the nice things, is that, at the very least they fixed all the problems, they cleaned them out, and they're pretty much brand new. That's the silver lining, I guess you could say. But what I'm getting at here is that even myself, somebody who's been doing this for years and years, I make mistakes. And when it comes to balancing the counterweight and using a big lens or a telescope and all this, a mistake here could cost you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. I know it cost me that much. So I don't want you to make the same mistakes that I've made. And that's why we're going to be doing this inside today. I'd recommend you do that as well on a carpeted floor. That way, if there is an accident, you're not going to be out waiting a month for your camera and lens to get repaired and dealing with all the costs. So with that in mind, let's talk about the counterweight kit first, and then we'll look at a couple different ways to balance your setup. All right, so we have our declination bracket right here, and the counterweight. You'll see everything's been attached as normal. And at any time, we can slide this up or down. But this brings us to the first consideration. We want to have a very low center of gravity. That way, we're getting the most leverage out of this little tiny counterweight, which isn't very heavy at all. So what I'm going to do is slide this down, and rather than leaving it way up here, where I'd have a very high center of gravity, I want to lower it right about there. And if you were to put your finger right up against the green piece, you should have about a finger width between that silver screw at the top and the white piece that's it's being attached to. That for me is just a rough guideline. So we're about as low as we can go, but we're still kind of safe, and we're giving us a little bit of room up above the star tracker. So that's the first thing you want to understand, is that we need a low center of gravity, and that's really the first part of balancing your star tracker. Next up, we have two different screws under here. We've got basically a clutch, which you can loosen. Sometimes it gets kind of stuck. There we go. And that's going to ultimately move things left and right once you have your camera attached. So I don't want you to get confused between these two, especially in the dark, because again, that's just another thing that could go wrong and cause you to have a broken camera. So make sure you get really comfortable with all these different screws and things and where they're at and how they work. But the other one here, if we push it upwards, contains a little, I believe it's a 1/4 inch screw that's coming up through the top here. So the way this would normally work, if you had a fairly lightweight little lens and camera, is you would just push that screw up and then screw it into the bottom of your tripod collar on your lens. You wouldn't want to screw this into your camera because that's not really going to work very well. So you need to have a tripod collar on your lens like you see here. If your lens doesn't have one, then you'll probably need to attach a ball head up here. Or to be honest, if you're using such a small camera lens anyway, you could probably get away with the standard ball head mounting block that we talked about, this guy here. But most of you, I assume, will have a tripod collar, so that's what we're going to focus on in this video. There is one big problem though. If you go that route, you're only going to be able to balance the right ascension, which is if we loosen the clutch and turn everything horizontally, this is our right ascension axis, where we move the counterweight in and out. You cannot balance the declination. So let me explain what declination is. If you had your camera attached here and you were zoomed in all the way, there's a good chance that it's going to be front heavy. So let's think about this. Right now, if I could just kind of hold it on my hand, see how it's pulling down? That means the front of my lens is front heavy, and it's not going to be properly balanced on the tracker. On the flip side, if it's zoomed in all the way and I have a big heavy camera, it might be back heavy. So really what we're trying to do is get it so that the balancing point is perfectly aligned depending on where our lens is zoomed into and also where we're aimed up at. There's a lot of different factors that come into play. And this is something I don't really see anybody talk about when it comes to using Star Adventurer. So I really want to make sure I show you the best way to balance not only the declination, but the right ascension. So let me grab a piece here and show you what I'm talking about. This is a $15 Arca Swiss clamp I bought on Amazon. I originally bought this for my auto guider videos, but it's since come in handy for balancing the counterweight. If you'd like to get this piece, I'll have the link up on the screen. It's like the newer 50mm Arca Swiss clamp. Realistically, you could buy any Arca Swiss clamp, it's not a big deal, but people want to know the exact gear that I'm using. Anyway, once you get this Arca Swiss clamp, there's going to be a little screw inside of here. You just unscrew it, take the screw out of the middle. Now that you've done that, you can screw the screw from the base here up into your clamp. There we go. I've now attached that little $15 Arca Swiss clamp to my declination bracket. Now watch what happens. If I take my lens with an Arca Swiss plate attached, everybody should have one of these lying around. If not, it's a good investment. This is like the standard for photography. So with this Arca Swiss plate attached to my lens, I can now slide it in and tighten down the clamp. Make sure when you're doing this that it's actually secure though, because this could be another way that you destroy your camera lens. So I'm really gonna make sure that's secure. Give it the wiggle test. We're on a carpeted floor, so we don't have the most stable surface, but there we go. We have a secure connection. All right, so let me show you now how to properly balance your counterweight. And this has been a month in the making. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna loosen our clutch here. And whenever you're doing this, I want a firm hand on the camera. That way if something does swing loose, hopefully you can grab a hold of it quickly. Or at the very least have a hand under the camera. So I loosen the clutch. We're gonna turn it horizontally. Again, hand always under the camera or on it. And then we're gonna move this counterweight in and out until neither side is pulling down. But look what happens. Even with the counterweight fully extended, the camera's too heavy. And that's another downside of this tracker, is that this little dinky counterweight they include is not enough weight to balance a lot of our setups. So unfortunately, what we're gonna have to do is get more creative. One thing we could try is lowering our declination bracket. I still have a little bit of room that I could lower it. The lower you go, the more essentially weight you're gonna get out of this. To be safe though, take off the camera lens with a firm hand on it. Got it? I'm super paranoid now after that incident. But now we're gonna lower this a little bit more. Probably right about there, tighten it down. All right, let's try that again. You saw that with the original thing, we're up a little higher. I could not balance it. I think now though I should have a fighting chance. So I'm gonna attach my Arca Swiss plate to the Arca Swiss clamp. Securely connected. Loosen the clutch, turn it horizontally. That's a lot better. It's now barely pulling down, but we're still not there. So let me show you one other thing you could do. If you're still having issues and you don't want to buy a second counterweight, you could grab a ball head. I'm gonna put this a little bit higher up. So let me go grab a ball head and I'll show you what I mean. So I've got my Benro IB2 ball head, which we covered in the gear section, and I'm just gonna screw this on the big screw right there. Think of this as a free counterweight, if you will. Okay, now let's try that one more time. We'll loosen our clutch, firm hand on the camera. Finally, the counterweight is just barely heavier than the camera. That means we finally balanced it more or less. There we go. Neither side is pulling down. We've now balanced the right ascension axis. Remember, this is right ascension, and we balance it with the counterweight essentially. And this is declination, which we're going to balance by moving things forwards and backwards. And this is also what allows us to reach any portion of the night sky, is with our right ascension and our declination. So I can aim up over here, I can aim up over there, I could even aim up behind me. But that brings us to the first problem with this setup. What you'll see is that there's a little screw here, or knob, that tightens down the Arca Swiss clamp. But watch what happens when I go right here. This knob hits the back of this knob, and I can't turn it any further. So it's a minor inconvenience and we could work around it. So let's say I'm going to photograph something back over there. I have to tighten everything down first, take my camera off, firm hand. I'm still short of breath just from freaking out about all this. It's the first time doing all this since the accident. So if you're wondering why I seem a little flustered. So now that we've taken the Arc of Swiss plate clamp off, if I'm having it hit down here, I'll just flip it around. So now the knobs are on this side. Pretty simple workaround, and it saves us from spending a lot more money on another solution. So there we go. All I did was flip the plate around. Now I can reattach my lens, although I gotta be on this side now. Okay, give it the wiggle test. Let's try that again. So if I want to aim up over here, now I don't have any problem doing it because I don't have this knob hitting back here. And then there we go. So that's just one thing you'll have to do at night, depending on where you're going to be aiming up at, is taking the plate off, reversing it, that way you can reach any portion of the sky. So now let's finally talk about how to balance our declination. Again, this axis right here. Let's say I'm photographing the Veil Nebula, which would be up in this region of the sky tonight, and I'm zoomed into 600 millimeters. See what happens right there? With me doing nothing, the front of the telescope's pulling down, or the lens. That means we're front heavy. The way we're going to fix that is to make everything more back heavy. So what you want to do is loosen this clamp with a firm hand on the camera, slide it back a little bit, tighten down the clamp, and let go. Now what happens? It's not pulling down anymore. So I balanced the declination axis by moving everything backwards a little bit. On the contrary, if we let go and everything pulls backwards, that means we're back heavy. The camera side is too heavy. So if I loosen my clamp, again, you saw that it slid like that, so you always want a firm hand on the camera when you're doing this. Push it forwards now, tighten it down, and now when I leave it there, it's probably actually a little bit front heavy to be honest, but there we go, it's no longer pulling backwards. So that's a very simple, cost-effective way and lightweight way to balance your declination. You didn't need to get a big dovetail plate and a big clamp, which is something I originally did, but then I realized you don't need to move things very far at all to get it balanced, so why would you add all that extra weight? This is much more cost-effective and easier to carry around and everything else. Because one of the biggest problems people have is that they just have so much gear, or they just buy the heaviest gear they possibly can, it seems like, and the more weight you have, the less accurate this tracker is going to be. We're trying to reduce the weight as much as possible. And that's the basics of balancing the counterweight. So let's recap everything one more time and make sure we're on the same page. First thing you want to do is make sure that the declination bracket itself is very low down. For those of you using a battery grip, you might have a problem where the battery grip interacts with the top of the tracker. It starts hitting it. So one of my number one tips I would say is get rid of the battery grip. You don't need it. A standard battery is going to last you the whole night, and if it doesn't, you can always pop in a fresh one. The battery grip will only add weight and problems for astrophotography, especially with a star tracker. So get rid of that right now if you have one. From there, again, everything's nice and low. We're going to loosen our right ascension, clutch, turn it horizontally, and if one side's pulling down, like if the camera was pulling down, I'd move the counterweight out. If the counterweight was fully extended and the camera was still pulling down, in my case it was, I just got a ball head and screwed it on. Simple, cost-effective solution. Most of you probably do have a ball head, and that's how you can utilize it rather than buying a second counterweight or anything else. Once you have the right ascension balanced, in my case, it could be a bit better. There we go, we can tighten it down. We've now done half of our balancing. Now we need to balance our declination, which is our kind of like left-right, if you will. This is going to change though depending on where you're aimed up at. So you always want to balance the declination after you've chosen your object, but before you've got it centered up in the frame, which is a mistake I made last night because there's so many things to keep track of. So what I'm getting at is, let's say you want to photograph Andromeda tonight. You know it's going to be roughly up over here. So what you might as well do is aim up in that general region of the sky. You don't have to get it precise. Zoom in at the focal length you think you're going to be at. I'd probably be at 400 to 500, and then let go of everything. If you see that it's pulling down, you're front heavy. So with the help of this $15 Arca Swiss clamp and an Arca Swiss plate, we'll just loosen it, slide it backwards a little bit, tighten it down, put it back where it was. We see that it's not pulling forwards anymore. It's also not pulling backwards. We've now balanced the declination. That's all there is to it. So now that we've balanced it, we could zoom back out. Doesn't matter if it throws things off because we're going to zoom back in later. But now we would try and find the object, dial in our camera settings, do everything else. And then by the time we're ready to go, we know that everything's balanced and we don't have to worry about it. So that's kind of, we'll cover that more in the telephoto tutorial, but that's all there is to it. Alternatively, let's say you're finished for Andromeda for the night and you want to photograph, well, let's say the Lagoon Nebula over here. So now we're coming way over. Another useful tip is that if you loosen the tripod collar, you can actually turn the whole camera like that. That way you're not craning your neck. It also probably throw off the weight distribution a little bit. And this brings me to one really important tip I haven't mentioned yet. You want to have the star tracker slightly east heavy. And if the tracker is always facing north, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, that means currently this is the east side of the tracker. On the other hand, if my camera was over here, then the camera side would be on the east. So it doesn't matter what's on this side, but this side needs to be a little bit heavier. And that just keeps the gears meshed together. So right now the camera is heavier, it's west heavy. That's not going to work. So let's make counterweight move out some more. And you want it so it's just very slightly pulling down. To be honest, if you got it perfectly balanced, I would be happy with that. If you're still kind of a beginner, don't worry about the east heavy thing. It's just going to complicate things. As long as it's perfectly balanced, nothing's pulling down, I'm happy with it. But I at least wanted to bring that up, where to get the gears meshed together perfectly, so there's no like slop in them, you would make whatever is on this side a little heavier, just barely. If it's noticeably pulling down, that's too heavy. So again, for most of us, don't worry about this, but I wanted to bring it up. Anyway, we've got it balanced. Now that we're aimed up at the Lagoon Nebula, I could zoom in on the lens. With the right ascension unlocked, I just let go and I make sure that it doesn't pull down or anything. In this case, there's not really anywhere it can go, so we're good there. But yeah, that's how you're going to balance your counterweight for the Star Adventurer. And I'm glad we finally got to cover this because I've been meaning to do this for a long time now. And it feels good to finally get this one out of the way. So the only thing you really need besides the declination bracket and counterweight kit, I would say, is that $15 Arca Swiss clamp and Arca Swiss plate that you can get on Amazon or wherever. That's all it is. Very simple, low-tech solution to balancing our declination, which again, I haven't seen anybody really talk about when it comes to the Star Adventurer. So I'm glad we covered that. If you don't have a huge telephoto lens like this or a big heavy camera, you could get away with just screwing it directly into the piece here, because chances are it won't be extremely front heavy or back heavy. But to be safe and get the best results out of your star tracker, especially at a telephoto focal length, you do want to use that Arca Swiss clamp so you can move things forwards and backwards. The only other thing I want to touch on in this video is that if you're going to be using a wide angle lens and doing Milky Way photography, in the past I said that you should use all this stuff, but I don't really recommend doing that anymore. It's just too much of a hassle for most of us, and the Star Tracker can handle it based on my experience in the past year, 2 years at this point. So what I'm getting at is if you're going to be using a wide angle lens for Milky Way photography, just grab the ball head adapter and your ball head, of course. Attach it like so. Drop it in. Then from here you can attach your camera and aim up at any portion of the sky you want. You don't need to worry about the declination bracket and counterweight kit for wide angle photography. And along those lines, if you had a really big, really right stuff ball head that's big and heavy, like 2-3 pounds, buy a cheaper, smaller, lighter ball head. I even got one that's super small and lightweight, and it's still able to hold a 14 to 24 f2.8 lens and my D750. So you'd be surprised what those little, provided you get a decent one, ball hits can do. So that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you understand how to balance your counterweight more effectively now, and you do it safely. That way you don't have any accidents like me. So we've got our In this video, I'm going to walk you through my full workflow for capturing the Milky Way galaxy and also nightscape images. And one of the things you're going to learn today is that you actually don't want to take your foreground and your star track shots in the exact same location. It seems everybody wants to do that, myself included when I first got my tracker. But what you're going to quickly realize is that it's just not feasible, because as soon as you turn on that star tracker, anything in the foreground will blur out. So you can imagine if you're taking a really nice foreground image where there's big trees or arch or mountains in the way, and then you turn on the tracker, you're going to have a nightmare when it comes to the blending. So if you follow my recommended technique, which I'll show you today, all you really need to start off with is a wide angle lens, maybe a light panel, and a tripod, and you could head out, even if you have to backpack maybe a mile or two in your location, capture some great foregrounds, and then you could set the tracker after that and capture your track shots for the sky. So I'm going to go grab my camera, lens, and tripod, and then we'll talk about how to capture your foreground images at night. Actually, before we do that, I thought I'd give you a look at my nearby scenery. That way I can explain what you're looking for in your foregrounds. So I'm going to take off the tripod here and try and keep things as stable as possible. But over here we have this nice grass with the juniper trees and the sun coming through. That might make for a great sunset photo, but in terms of a Milky Way composition, you know, those trees are going to be very hard to blend, even using some of my techniques. So I probably wouldn't focus on them too much. I'd rather have these interesting mesas with the red rocks and everything. I think that'll be a more interesting foreground. Now, once I find something I think is going to work, I also have to consider which direction am I facing, because the Milky Way core, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, is going to be in the southern sky. And in this case, south is over here. Now there is kind of a nice view out in the distance over there. And maybe if I got a higher elevation, that would make for an interesting foreground. It'd be kind of flat, but I might be able to find something that would work. So what I'm getting at here is that you need to find a foreground that matches where the Milky Way is going to be at. For those of us, again, in the northern hemisphere, you want to look south generally, but you can also look to the north. You'll get a more subdued portion of the Milky Way, but a lot of people don't photograph it, and it can make for a really unique photo. And when I'm scouting out, I usually like to come out about this time of day, especially in the desert when it's not too hot. That way I can plan things out and say, okay, the Milky Way is going to be up over here. Let me see if I can find maybe some interesting trees or rocks in that direction. And it's much better to do this during the day rather than at night, because you can't see hardly anything. So that's what I'd always recommend first thing, is to go out sometime during maybe the early morning, late afternoon, so you can double things and get sunset or sunrise shots and plan things out before it gets too dark. Once you find a foreground you like, now we need to start taking our test photos to get the composition looking perfect. Remember, I only recommend going out with a wide angle lens, tripod, ball head camera. That's all you need right now. You don't necessarily want to lug that big star tracker on with you everywhere you go. We're going light and easy today. So with my camera set up here, the first thing I want to do is put on full manual mode. And then for my shutter speed, normally you want to do, I would say, 15 seconds to start off with. That's fairly quick. If your shutter speed is on 15 seconds, your ISO should be 12,800. And this is going to be really important later on, so I'd recommend that you write these down. Again, 15 seconds, ISO 12,800. Your aperture could be either f2.8 or f4, depending on your lens. That one's up to you. Once you have those camera settings dialed in, now we need to make sure that the lens is at least relatively focused. So I'm just going to look on my ring here and put it to just to the right of infinity. I know that's a good sweet spot for this particular lens. If you're not sure about your lens though, and you're having trouble focusing, one thing you might want to do is just shine a bright headlamp on your foreground with live view turned on. and hopefully there's nobody around, because you're really going to piss them off if you keep turning on your light. So that's one of my pet peeves is, obviously, if you're out hiking to a location, be safe, keep that headlamp turned on, because there's nothing worse than breaking your leg out there in the middle of the night. However, once you get out there on location, get set up, and then at least turn on the red light, but try and learn how to use your camera in the dark while still being safe, because when there's other people around, it gets very frustrating to try and take your shots when random headlights are always turning on. But again, if you can't see the foreground to focus on and there's nobody else around, turn it on, turn on live view, and just adjust your focusing ring until the foreground looks as sharp as possible. If you can't really see the foreground even with the headlamp on, you should be able to see some bright stars. So for example, if I'm facing this direction, but Jupiter is over there, that's fine. I'll just loosen my ball head, swing the camera around, and I'm going to use Jupiter to focus on, because on almost every live view system, if you turn on live view, you should be able to see Jupiter. You can zoom in and then focus to make it as small as possible. And you know, at least at 14 to 24 millimeters, if Jupiter is sharp, your foreground is going to be sharp, unless you're like this close to the foreground. Then in that case, you might have to do some focus stacking. But personally, I don't ever do focus stacking at night. I take a single f2.8 or f4 image, focused on the stars normally, and that looks just fine. So do what you got to do to get focused, but those are some of my recommended tips. And then once you got things looking fairly sharp, we can take that first test photo. Again, 15 seconds, f2.8 or f4, ISO 12,800. Once it's complete, we can hit the playback button and then zoom in on the back of our screen. Now would be a good time also to turn down your monitor brightness, because it's probably super bright right now. So if you go into your menu, go down to the settings and put the monitor brightness down to -5 or the lowest it'll go. That'll make the images more natural and they won't look overly bright. Now that we've fixed the brightness, we can double check that playback image and see if we like the composition. More often than not, it doesn't look right on the first attempt. So we'll look at it and say, you know what, it needs to be turned a little bit. So I'll loosen my ball head, adjust it, and then take another photo. At this point, I want to mention, if you have a newer camera, you could always adjust your camera settings. Rather than 15 seconds, you can drop it down to just 8 seconds. And for your ISO, you can go up to 25,600. This is still keeping the same brightness, but you're just saving yourself some time. So again, we're doing 8 seconds, 25,600 for the ISO. It's just up to what your camera can handle. The whole point here is to take a quick exposure to judge the scene. That way we're not wasting a lot of valuable time out here. Anyway, we'll take another photo. Once it's complete, just keep doing this until you get the composition looking just the way you want. Maybe you want to zoom in a little bit, zoom out. Just do what you got to do. It's really up to you to get an interesting composition. Normally, I like to have the Milky Way complementing it, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. But just spend some time and get that composition looking really good. When you're finally ready to begin taking your real photo, we need to go grab a remote, because rather than doing a 15 or 20 or 30 second long image, we're going to be shooting 4, 5, 6 minutes, maybe even longer. That way, even if you have an older camera or something, you're still going to get a lot of light and ultimately a great photo. Before I attach my remote, I also grabbed my little remote holder, which is just a beer koozie with a safety pin through it. You could also buy maybe an actual remote holder that'll go on your tripod leg. Just get something, because I don't want your remote dangling off the side of the camera. That's a mistake I see a lot of beginners make, and that's going to cause some instability. So make sure you get anything that'll hold the remote and then attach it however you need to your tripod. In this case, I'm using the Velo Shutter Boss 2 as my remote. I'm going to plug it in, and then I'll just drop this in my holder here. Now we need to talk about our actual camera settings. So I'm assuming at this point you've gotten a really nice composition. If you have a light panel, it's not too bright or too dim. If it is, you'll need to keep adjusting it until it looks good with those camera settings that we talked about earlier. I'd highly recommend too that you hit your playback button, zoom in all the way, and really just look over the image right now. Because if you're overlooking anything, it's going to come back to haunt you. This is kind of our last chance before we start investing a lot of time. Provided everything looks good though, now we're going to dial in our real camera settings. We're not going to do those very high ISO short exposures anymore. So I'd recommend first you put your shutter speed to bulb mode. On Nikon cameras and Sony, you're just going to go past 30 seconds and now you'll be on bulb. If you're on some Canon cameras, there might be a B here on your top dial. that also stands for bulb. If you're not sure, check your camera's manual. Once you have bulb mode set, now we can adjust our ISO, which I normally put it to either 800 or more often now I use ISO 1600, and that usually works pretty well. Your aperture is going to stay the same as it's been, either f2.8 or f4. Either of those will work fine. And now we're ready to set up our remote. One other thing I'd recommend is that since we're taking a photo that could be anywhere from 4 to 8 minutes long, I'd recommend you turn on long exposure noise reduction in your camera's menu. This is essentially going to double your shutter speed. So if you take a 4-minute long photo, it's going to take a total of 8 minutes to complete, because the camera takes a light frame that's 4 minutes long, then it takes a dark frame that's 4 minutes long, it combines the two, and it removes the hot pixels automatically. And for almost every single camera, this is going to be a lifesaver. Otherwise, we have to do it in post-processing, which we can fix this problem in about 10 seconds, but the results aren't going to be as good as fixing it in camera. So this is one of the things I recommend you do on your first couple nights out, is just test long exposure noise reduction. See if it's worth doubling your shutter speed to you, or if you'd rather fix that problem in post-processing. When it comes to long exposure noise reduction, every camera is going to be a little bit different. I know on most Nikons you can hit the I button, and then eventually you'll see long exposure noise reduction, and we'll turn that on. It's also abbreviated LENR. That's the shorthand for it. Now I want to make sure I'm clear here. When that's turned on, if you're shooting longer than a 1 second long exposure, it will automatically engage. So we have to remember to turn this off when we're taking our test photos and turn it on when we're taking our really long exposures. Again, I'd recommend you test this out on your own camera. That way you decide if it's worth that extra time investment or not. Let's recap everything we've just covered, and then we'll continue on. My shutter speed is on bulb mode. My aperture in this case is f2.8, and my ISO is 1600. I've also turned on long exposure noise reduction. My white balance, it really doesn't matter. Since we're shooting in RAW, you could use whatever you want. We're always going to fix it later in post anyway, so I don't really get concerned about the white balance. Now the only thing left is to set up our remote. If you turn on the remote, you'll have a variety of different options if you have a halfway decent remote. There's usually like a self-timer delay, which will basically give you a countdown after you hit the timer start stop button. That way you can put the remote in the holder and step away without shaking anything. There's also a long, or sometimes that's just abbreviated as your shutter speed on here. So you'll have to understand the terminology of your remote. Again, check the manual. But on the Velo, it's labeled long. That's our shutter speed. I'd recommend you set this to 4 minutes to begin with. If you have an older camera, or if your camera's just not that good in low light, you might want to shoot longer than 4 minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes. I wouldn't go any longer than that though, because with long exposure noise reduction turned on, that's a lot of time to invest in a single composition, and you're going to eventually reach the point with diminishing returns. So personally, I usually shoot 4 to 5 minutes, but I have really good cameras, so I can get away with it. So in your case, you might want to go 5 or 6, but start with 4, make that your baseline, and then you can always go longer if you decide that your photos are still a little bit grainy. I also want to mention that I'm only taking a single 4-minute long photo for the foreground. I'm not going to take multiple images and stack them together. That just creates a lot more work, and for me, a single exposure works just well enough. So that's our shutter speed, also abbreviated long. The interval, we don't have to worry about that. We're just taking a single exposure. The number, put that to 1, and there we go. Now that we've dialed all that in, we should be able to hit timer start stop, and it's going to begin our photo. But I want to warn you, if you didn't turn off autofocus and you hit the timer start stop, on most remotes that will trigger the camera to autofocus, and it's going to completely ruin the image. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you flip the camera or the lens to manual focus. Also turn off any kind of vibration control. Hopefully you've done that before now, but if not, now's the time to fix all that. All right, so we're ready to go. We've double checked everything. I'm going to hit timer start stop. It's going to count down because I put a 5-second delay, and then that gives me just enough time to get out of here. And I don't want to touch the camera because even just walking around here, it might be enough to shake things. One other thing you have to keep in mind is while this 4-minute long photo is being taken, if you're with other people and somebody turns on a headlamp, that could ruin your shot. So that's one of the downsides of this method, is that if you're in a very crowded location like Arches National Park and you've got cars driving by, you've got people walking by, this method might not work that well. So that's where you might actually want to use a faster shutter speed, maybe just 1 minute, or even if you had to, 30 seconds. And in that case, I would take multiple photos and stack them together in post-processing. There's nothing wrong with that method, it's just more work. So that's just something you'll need to think about when you're out there on location. Do I have 4 minutes where nobody's going to bother me? Or am I going to be really cutting it close? Maybe it'd be better off taking 4 1-minute exposures, maybe even 5. That's up to you. But think that through, and if you need to, adjust your settings accordingly. Don't forget, if you have long exposure noise reduction turned on, once that first 4-minute long exposure ends, on Nikon camera it'll say job and R for another 4 minutes, which means it's taking that dark frame. So no matter what you do, the camera's not going to react. That's totally normal. And if somebody does happen to like walk right in front of the camera with a headlamp during the dark frame, it shouldn't hurt anything because the mirror is down. No light's going to be coming into the camera anyway. So I don't want you to freak out if somebody does turn on light during the dark frame. It's not going to show up in the photo. When that image finally completes, you'll hear it click. You'll be pretty happy because it'll seem like an eternity. I can guarantee you of that. Then we'll click the playback button and see how things look. Maybe we realize one of the most common things is that we forgot to turn the ISO down. So if the image is super bright, double check that you actually lower the ISO to 800 or 1600. And if you're on a Canon camera, you might even want to go to 3200 if you have an older DSLR, because your sensors aren't that good if you have to increase things in post. Again, this is always up to you to determine how your camera performs. I'm just giving you what I know works for most Nikon cameras and just in general, some of the best settings that I've found to work for a lot of people. Anyway, hopefully you got a good first composition. It's not too bright, it's not too dark, nothing ruined the shot, and you've also zoomed in to verify that it's still focused. Maybe a gust of wind blurred things out. Those are all things you want to check over right now, because since we invested that much time in it, we don't want to leave and then get back to the computer and realize it wasn't even a good shot to begin with. If everything looks good though, now that we've gotten our first good composition, maybe you want to walk 10 feet over there and try a different composition. So if you want to do that, that's fine. I'd recommend trying to get 3 or 4 really nice foregrounds, and then we could worry about the star tracker. And if you decide to do that, there's one other thing I should mention. When you go to take your next set of foreground shots, make sure you go back to either 15 seconds or 8 seconds for your shutter speed, ISO 12,800 or 25,600, and remember to turn off long exposure noise reduction. Otherwise, that 15-second photo is going to take 30 seconds to complete. So that's the thing, you got to remember to turn off long exposure noise reduction for the test photos and then turn it back on for your actual composition. I think you get the idea by now. I don't want to drag this out too much, but that's really all I do is I go out there, I take my high ISO test photos, focus the lens, adjust the composition until I really like it. Then I set up the remote, put the camera on bulb mode, and take a 4-minute long exposure at ISO 1600 with long exposure noise reduction turned on. That's kind of my go-to. Once that exposure ends, I make sure it looks good, and then I just keep doing that until I've gotten a handful of really nice foreground shots. Once you're happy with all your foregrounds, now we can worry about the star tracker. And like I said, I normally go out to the car and set up right in the parking lot because chances are you're going to have a nice, clear, wide open sky, whereas you're not going to have that when you're taking your foreground with the Milky Way behind it. So in this case, I'm going to pack up, go to the car, and grab my star tracker. When you get back to the parking lot, you want to find an area that gives you the most view of the night sky. In this case, if I was facing north, I'd be perfect right here. I could set up my star tracker, and then with my wide-angle lens, I can angle up like this, so I'm getting 90% sky, 10% foreground. However, let's say over here, if this was south, I obviously wouldn't want to step the star tracker right here, because now I'm going to have all these tree branches in the way, and that's not going to work. Even just walking back to the other side of the parking lot over here, now if I turn around, I'm able to get much more sky. See that? And then we'd be pretty good. Or down over here, of course. Just get away from that big old dead tree. Maybe come out somewhere over here. We got that tree. You just got to find the widest open sky you can, and I guarantee it's going to make things a lot easier for you. And again, we want to get about 90% sky, 10% foreground once we set up our star tracker. Also, you don't necessarily have to go back to the parking lot. For me, that's just always the easiest thing, and I try and keep things as easy as possible. But maybe if you're hiking out to a location and there's a nice wide open field halfway to your foreground, you could set up there. Whatever you want to do. My whole point here though is just to get you thinking that don't set up right next to a big tree or a big mesa like this if you can help it. Get out to a nearby area with as little foreground obstructions as possible. That's kind of what we want to do now when we're setting up our star tracker. When you find your nice, flat, wide open area with a lot of sky, and you set up your star tracker like you see here, now we can attach our ball head, our camera, and begin shooting. So the first thing I want to do is actually my polar alignment. That way we can get sharp stars, of course. So to do our polar alignment, we already have the full tutorial for that. Just to recap though, you need to find north. In my case, north is up over there. If you're not sure which direction north is, you can use an app on your smartphone like Photo Pills or a compass app, whatever you want to do. But figure out which direction north is. Again, this is for those of us in the northern hemisphere. And then reposition your tripod to face that direction. Once you're facing north, I like to find the Big Dipper. Once I find the Big Dipper, I can take the corner star. That'll take me to Polaris just by drawing a straight line out to it. Now that I can actually see Polaris with my naked eye, I'm going to move the tripod again, crouch down, and I want to see Polaris centered up over the top of the star tracker, as close as I can get anyway. Once I've got Polaris centered up over the top of the star tracker, now I'd like to check that all my legs are fully extended. They are. I'm going to push down on all my legs, make sure they don't collapse. Finally, I'll double check the bubble level and adjust it until I'm not at a weird angle. Looks like right about there should be good. Now, I just want to crouch down again, make sure Polaris is still over the top of the tracker. Finally, I can look through the polar scope and begin doing my polar alignment. Now in this case, the reticle is crooked, so I can loosen my clutch, turn the front piece while I'm looking through here to get it lined up with 0, 3, 6, and 9. If you can't see your reticle, that's where we're going to use our red headlamp. We'll turn it on, flash it over the front briefly to see the reticle, and then turn it as needed. There we go. Now thankfully for Milky Way photography, you don't really have to be that precise with the polar alignment. As long as you can keep the North Star fairly close to the circle, you'll still be able to shoot 4 minutes or longer with sharp stars at about 14 millimeters. It's still a good idea though to get it as close as possible. So what I want to do now is load up the Star Adventurer mini console, also known as the SAM console app, on my smartphone, whether you're on Android or iPhone. When you load up that application, you can click on the Polar Clock utility. Then from there, we'll click on Location in the upper right. That's going to tell us our current latitude and longitude, in this case 37 degrees north. Now that we know our latitude, make sure your base has been set correctly. If not, adjust it. In my case, I'm pretty high. I'm at about 45 degrees, not 37. So I'm going to make my adjustments. Now if we go back to the application, we're going to see that reticle, and it's going to tell us where to position Polaris, somewhere on that circle. Now that I know where to position it, I'm going to look back through my scope and see if I see the North Star somewhere in there. If I don't see the North Star in there, that's okay. The way around that is to pick up the tripod and move the whole thing left and right while you're looking through there. Eventually, you'll see the North Star drift into the field of view. When you finally see the North Star inside of your polar scope, hopefully when you set the tripod down, it doesn't disappear from the field of view. If it does, try it again. And that's one of the problems I have with this tripod and the hammock here, is that it tries to pull the legs in all the time. So that way, when I set the tripod down, I have to re-extend the legs, and that sometimes causes me to lose it. But just keep practicing this technique, and I guarantee it'll make your night a lot easier. Anyway, once you get Polaris somewhere there in your field of view, now we can use our azimuth adjustment screws. We're going to turn both same direction, same time. That'll move Polaris left and right inside of the polar scope. We can also use the altitude knob to move the North Star up and down. And very simply, what we want to do is turn on a red headlamp, flash it over the front to see the reticle, see where the reticle is compared to Polaris, make some adjustments, getting it closer where it should be. Flash the red light over, see how much closer we are, make some more adjustments. Keep doing this until Polaris matches the position we saw on our smartphone app. At that point, you've done a polar alignment. Remember, since we're shooting with a wide-angle lens, this doesn't have to be perfect. I don't want you to sit here and waste an hour getting that polar alignment spot on. As long as it's actually Polaris you're looking at, as long as it's somewhere near that inner circle, you're going to be okay. Then, once you've gotten your polar alignment looking pretty good, if not perfect, we'll tighten down our clutch, grab our ball head adapter here, slide that in here, and then tighten it down. If you had the original version of this course from 2018, I used to recommend bringing out the counterweights and declination and all that, the big old thing. I don't really recommend doing it anymore, even with a big camera and lens, because it's just too much hassle, and the Star Adventurer can handle it. You'll be okay without it. So my new recommended method for 2020 is just to use the ball head mounting adapter and a ball head. With that in mind though, I would recommend getting a smaller ball head if you've got a really big one, or a 3-way panning head or something like that. Even just this simple Benro IB2 ball head will do a great job. We talk about all this in the gear section of the course if you want to go back and rewatch those videos, but that would be something to consider. If you've got an overly sized, overly large ball head, you might want to swap that out for something a bit smaller and lighter. It'll put less stress on your star tracker. Finally, I can go grab my camera, and then we'll talk about setting that up and begin taking our Milky Way photos. Today I'm using the Nikon D750 with the Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens. As you can see, that's a pretty big setup, but it'll still work okay. And I don't need, again, to bring out the counterweights and everything else. This will work just fine. So I'm going to attach my camera to the ball head, make sure it's really locked on here. Also, you want to make sure that the ball head has been securely connected to the green piece. So really tighten that down, because I don't want this to swing loose in the middle of the night. But there we go. We've now attached our camera to the star tracker. And the great thing is you can aim the camera in any direction you want. The tracker is always going to be facing north. So if you wanted to capture the northern Milky Way, you could aim up over here. If you wanted to capture the core of the Milky Way that everybody likes, that's going to be in the southern sky. So we could come around over here and aim our camera up to the sky. There we go. And another thing I want to mention is that when you attach everything, make sure you don't accidentally kick the tripod or turn the base, because that'll throw off your polar alignment. And there's no way to double check the polar alignment anymore unless we take this whole thing off. So I'd recommend you try and do as minimal adjustments from here on out as possible. However, if you think you screwed up the polar alignment, you could just slide the whole thing off, or to be safer, take the camera off first, set it down somewhere, then take off this whole piece here on the front, the ball head and the green piece, and double check the alignment. If you need to, readjust it, attach this piece, and then reattach your camera. That might not be a bad idea, just to make sure we're going to get the best possible results tonight. At this stage in the workflow, we need to click on our playback button and look back at our earlier photos that we took of the foreground, because what I recommend you do is mimic your compositions that you took earlier in the night. In other words, if you took your foreground shot and the Milky Way was pretty much dead center, we want to mimic that composition right now, where we're at the same focal length and the Milky Way is in the center of the frame. However, if the Milky Way is off in a corner, we need to do that as well here with the star tracker. The reason we're going to mimic these compositions is that it's going to make the blending so much easier. And not only that, it's going to be a faithful blend. That way, if you post these online and people are looking them over, they're not even going to be able to tell that you did a blend if you follow my recommended techniques. And in this case, what I do is just come around to the back of the camera, click on my playback, and then let's say we're over at Mobius Arch and I've got the Milky Way kind of right in the center but slightly slanted. Now I need to recreate that composition here with the star tracker. Remember though, you want 90% sky, 10% foreground, because anything in the foreground is going to blur out. So if you have a tree or something, get rid of it right now. You might have to remove the tripod and set up somewhere else. That's okay. Just redoing that will save you more time when you get to the computer. So what I want to stress here is that you have a clear, wide open horizon with as few obstructions as possible. Now I'm going to readjust my ball head, make sure I'm at the same focal length as I was in that earlier foreground composition, and then we could take our high ISO test photos using the same settings as we did earlier in the night. In this case, 15 seconds, ISO 12800, f2.8 or f4. Alternatively, you could do 8 seconds, ISO 25600 to save some time. Also verify that long exposure noise reduction is turned off. That way, you're not wasting any time with that. And then take a photo. Once it's complete, we'll hit the playback button and make sure that you have 90% sky, 10% foreground, and the stars are sharp. If the stars aren't sharp, we can turn on live view, find a big bright star, zoom in on it, and then turn our focus ring back and forth until the star is as small as possible. You should have already turned off all the vibration control and everything else by now, so that shouldn't be a factor. And then if the stars look good, we'll take another test photo and we'll see if that looks any better. Now would probably be a good time too to turn on the star tracker if you haven't done so already. So I'm going to turn mine to the star tracking speed. That way we won't have any more star trails. And I'll take one more photo. This time though, hopefully the composition looks very faithful to our earlier foreground shot that we took. Provided you like the composition, the stars are sharp, the tracker's turned on, you're not getting star trails at this point, you shouldn't be. Now we can grab our remote and reattach that to the camera. Then we'll begin taking our real exposures. And the great thing is, we're just going to copy everything we did earlier in the night. So if you took a 4-minute long photo at ISO 1600, we're going to do the same thing right now. So it's kind of nice that half the work in some aspects is already done. So I'm going to attach my remote. And all the remote settings should be the same, so you shouldn't have to adjust anything really. And then after you've gotten the remote plugged in, we'll put it here in the koozie. And then just verify that we're on bulb mode for our shutter speed. Our ISO, you could actually probably lower it a little bit, but generally, like I said, I recommend using the exact same camera settings that you used for your foreground. So in my case, that's normally ISO 800 or 1600, f2.8 or f4, and a shutter speed of 4 minutes. If you're not sure what your foreground shots were, you should be able to see the info if you hit one of the buttons on the back of your camera. That should pull up the shutter speed and everything else if you're not sure. The only thing that's really going to change between our foreground shots and our track shots is long exposure noise reduction. For most of you, I don't recommend using long exposure noise reduction with the star tracker because the algorithms tend to have a hard time between stars and hot pixels, and most people wouldn't even notice if there was a hot pixel compared to a star. So generally, I turn off long exposure noise reduction when I'm using my tracker, but that's something else you'll want to test out on your own and see if it's worth doing that or not. All that's left at this point is to hit the timer start stop button on a remote and let the tracker run. Let's do a quick recap while this is taking the photo. We're doing a 4-minute long image, ISO 800 or 1600, f2.8 or f4, no long exposure noise reduction. The tracker has been turned on, I see the lights, and I'm on the star tracking speed. I made sure that my bubble level is fairly flat, I double checked my polar alignment before I attached everything, and I've got 90% sky, 10% foreground with minimal obstructions in the way. Once my timer ends, I can check my playback, and the first thing I want to do is zoom in all the way and verify that the stars are actually sharp. If not, maybe they're a little bit blurry from just the focus was off. Now you'd want to turn on live view, refocus the lens, and try again. Or if you have star trails, either the star tracker is not turned on, the hemisphere switch was set incorrectly, the tracking speed was set incorrectly, or at some point you kick the tripod and the polar alignment is no longer accurate. I'd recommend if you're getting star trails and you verified the tracker was on, to take off the camera, take off the ball head, and look through the polar scope one more time, making sure you redo the alignment, because that's most likely why you're getting star trails. But hopefully you got a great shot for the sky. And if you followed my workflow today, this will be very easy to take your track sky shot, your static foreground shot, blend them together, and create a really fantastic image that's going to look 10 times better than anything we can get with just a standard 15-second long exposure. From here, you could continue to look back at your earlier foreground compositions and then recreate the Milky Way position right here with 90% sky, 10% foreground. That's really all I do is I take my foreground shots at the beginning of the night and then I set up the star tracker, mimic my earlier compositions in terms of the Milky Way with the star tracker, and then I have my foreground and sky and I can blend them together. The final thing I want to mention today is that if you wait too long between your foreground and your sky compositions, the stars will move pretty substantially, and that can really screw you up if you're trying to do a faithful blend. That's one of the issues I ran into over the years, is that I might spend 2 hours out there taking foregrounds, hike an hour back to the car, spend 20 minutes setting up the star tracker. By the time I'm taking my first Milky Way composition, it's already been 2 hours since my first foreground. And since the stars have moved so much across the sky, I can no longer get a faithful blend just because the position doesn't match. For most of you, that's not going to be that big of a deal, but for me, I'm always trying to keep things as realistic as possible. So that's just one more thing I want to mention, is that the less time between your foreground and sky shots, the better, and hopefully you'll be able to get all that done in a pretty short amount of time. All right, well, that's all I got for you in this full-length workflow. Hopefully now I've demystified the Milky Way process that I follow. And if you still have a few questions, they'll probably get answered in the post-processing. We're really going to go in depth on blending your foreground and sky shots and everything else. I'll also give you some more tips in there. So there might be a few little things I overlooked, but we will cover those again in the post-processing module. Very simply, all you have to do is take very high ISO test photos, get the lens focused, get the composition look good, and then take a 4-minute long photo at ISO 1600. That's a really good starting point. Once you take your foreground shot or multiple shots, you can set up the star tracker nearby, have a nice flat clear horizon when possible, and then take your track shots. Use the exact same settings that you did for the foreground, and also try and get the Milky Way in the same position it was between your sky shot and your foreground shot. If you can do all that, you'll be in great shape when it comes to our blending, which we'll cover in the following videos. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to take some really spectacular photos of nebula and galaxies with your Star Adventurer and just a telephoto lens. You really don't need more than that. I'm personally going to be using a Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens today. That's one of my favorite lenses for deep space because you get a huge range that allows you to do a lot of interesting things. And for most of the objects that we can photograph with just a standard DSLR, you can really fill the frame nicely between 400 and 500 millimeters. So if you are thinking about getting a new lens, that's a great option. You could also get something like a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. But generally you do want to get more than 200 millimeters if you're on a full frame camera, because we do have such a wide field of view. In any event, grab whatever telephoto lens you have and follow along with me. I'd recommend doing this in the house today just so you can practice these skills, and then we could head out there on location for real, and it should make your night a lot easier. As always, the first thing we need to do is our polar alignment. And because we're shooting at telephoto focal lengths, you really got to be accurate today. You know, if you're doing wide angle, you could have a rough alignment, it won't really hurt anything. But tonight, if that polar alignment isn't dead accurate, you're going to have problems. So for those of us in the northern hemisphere, we need to find north. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you need to find south. Now you can either use a smartphone app, a compass, whatever you want to do. Personally, for me, I just look for the Big Dipper because I'm here in the northern hemisphere. And then what you want to do once you find the Big Dipper is take the corner star right there, draw kind of a straight, slightly curved line out, and that'll take you to Polaris. If you're in a fairly light polluted area, you should see the Big Dipper no problem, and even the North Star. In fact, it actually becomes more difficult when you're out in a very dark sky because there's so many more stars that are visible, you tend to lose the North Star. It's not the brightest one up there, so keep that in mind. I should also mention that the Big Dipper does rotate around the North Star throughout the night and throughout the year. So it's not always going to look like you see here in the video. It might be in a different orientation. But that's where, again, you can always refer back to a smartphone app like Stellarium, which we've talked about in some of the other videos. And we'll get into that more here in a minute. But in any event, find north. For me, I find the Big Dipper. And then ultimately we need to find the North Star, Polaris. Once you see that up in the sky, then we can grab our star tracker and rearrange everything. So let's say I know it's up over there. I can pick up my tripod, place it down, extend all the legs. The first thing I do here though is I just push down. Well, you already see the problem. When I push down on this leg, the leg lock wasn't completely tight. And that happens to me all the time. So what I need to do is extend it again and really tighten down all of my leg locks and give it another push test. There we go. That's the number one thing I have happen to me is I just forget to do that sometimes. So there we go. We know our legs aren't going anywhere from here on out. Now would also be a good time to double check our bubble level here on the base. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's fairly close. As we talked about in the basics video, don't stress out about this too much. Just take a step back and make sure, the tripod's not tilting in a certain direction or anything like that, and you should be okay. But it does help to just get it fairly level in any event. There we go. So we face north, we've got it level, we verified the legs are all locked down nice and tight. Another thing I'd recommend doing is actually extending the legs fully, because sometimes they're not fully extended and that can cause the whole thing to tip over. So we're just getting all the simple, easy to fix things out of the way right now. At this point, we need to get the star tracker aimed up directly at Polaris. The way I like to do that is just crouch down behind the star tracker and just get the North Star centered up over the top. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you kind of just want to get it as close as you can to the center. That'll just make everything easier moving forward. And in fact, there is like a little cutout hole right here on the Star Adventurer. You could look through that, but if you've got not the greatest eyes, you probably won't see anything through there anyway. Again, there's a little hole cut out, so I don't really rely on that. I just look over the top of the tracker. For me, that's a lot easier. And if you need to move it left or right a little bit, just pick up your tripod. If you got it as close as you can, now would be another time to pull all the legs out, push them down, check your bubble level. There we go. We've now just done a rough polar alignment, and now we can really get a lot more precise using the polar scope. If you're ready to look through the polar scope, you can take off the caps and the plugs and everything else. You might also want to loosen the clutch here, the black knobs on the front, turn them upwards. And then once that's loose, we should be able to turn this big screw and ultimately the polar scope reticle inside. So what I'd like you to do is look through the scope, turn this big old screw on the front, and line it up like a clock with 0, 3, 6, and 9. Again, this is for those of you in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, I'd recommend you go watch that polar alignment video, and you could just substitute all those techniques in over what I'm talking about right now. But once you have the polar scope lined up, like you see here on the screen, now we need to figure out where Polaris is going to go. So for this, you will need an application on your smartphone. If you're on Android, I use an app called Polar Finder. If you're on iPhone, you can use there's a lot of different apps out there. I don't have an iPhone, but I'll have a couple of options up on screen. However you want to do it though, open up your Polar Scope app, and then it should automatically pull in your latitude and longitude. In this case, I'm demoing with Polar Finder, but I'm going to click on the wrench, and I want to verify first of all that my reticle type is on Star Adventurer. Once we're on Star Adventurer, we can turn on night mode if we'd like. I like to put the star size to extra large so I can actually see it. And then most importantly, the longitude source, make sure that's on use GPS and your hemisphere is set correctly. If you've done all that, we can hit back. There we go. Now we see the same reticle as we do inside of our polar scope. Now that I know where Polaris needs to be, I need to, of course, get it visible in our polar scope. And I'm going to show you my #1 technique for doing a polar alignment in 30 seconds or less. This is guaranteed to make your night a lot easier. And we have covered this in the polar alignment video, but what you want to do, grab your tripod, look through the scope until you can actually see the stars, pick up the tripod and just swing it left and right very slowly, maybe even just a tad up and down. And when you're doing this, at some point you're going to see a star that's bigger and brighter than anything else up there in the night sky, and that is Polaris. Again, if you're in a light polluted area, this will actually be a lot easier because you're probably only going to see Polaris through there. Out here in Utah, we've got very dark skies, and there's quite a few that look just like Polaris. And unless I actually pick up the tripod, move things left and right, I'm not going to know for sure if it's Polaris or not until I say, hey, that one right there, that's the biggest and brightest. Once I get it in the viewfinder, I want to put the tripod down very gently, trying to keep it still there in the frame. Now, of course, we have to go back, pull out all of our legs, that way they're not in anymore. Double check that we're still flat on the bubble level, and then take another glance through and verify we didn't lose it. If you did, you can try picking it up again. But for me, that really cuts down on the time it takes to do a polar alignment. Another thing we need to do is dial in our latitude on the base. That could also throw you off if this is not set correctly. So for that, you can either use your Polar Finder app. It should tell you on there what your latitude is. In my case, 37 degrees north. Alternatively, you can use the SAM console app. And if you go in the SAM console app, this is another way you can do your polar alignment. There's actually a polar clock utility in here, and this will work just fine for both iPhone and Android. So this is probably going to be your best solution, honestly. So in the SAM console app, we'll click on location in the upper right, and again, verify that we have our latitude and longitude. And we see the same positioning here as we did in Polar Finder. So now that we have all the information we need, I'm going to dial my latitude in on the base if it wasn't done so already. I think it's a little bit high. There we go. Now I want to look through the polar scope one more time and see if Polaris is still in there. If it's not, or if I'm not sure if that's actually Polaris, I'll just pick up the tripod again, move it left and right until I see it in the frame. There we go. It's somewhere in there now. That's what I want you to do as well. One other thing I want to mention is that this takes a lot of practice. It's taken me years to get to the point where I can do a polar alignment in 30 seconds or less. So what I'd like you to do is whenever you have even a partly cloudy night, go out on your front or your back porch or whatever you have and just practice your polar alignment skills. This is something that the more you do it, the more your brain is going to register what Polaris looks like, and just practicing these movements is really going to help you out there at night. Moving on, once you have Polaris visible somewhere in the polar scope, now we're going to use our altitude knob here on the front and our azimuth screws here on the back to move Polaris either up, down, left, or right, and get it right on the reticle as we saw a minute ago. So I'm going to look back through my scope, find Polaris, and then through my azimuth screws, I'm going to turn both in the same direction at the same time. That's going to move the North Star either left or right. Once I've gotten the North Star right about where it needs to be in terms of left, right, then I can adjust my altitude knob. You don't have to do it in this order. You can do it in the opposite. It doesn't really matter. But we'll adjust our altitude, and there we go. Once we have it as close as we think we can get, remember, take your azimuth screws here, turn one towards you, one away from you until they're nice and tight. That'll lock them down. And also verify that all the locks and things are tight on your base. That way it doesn't move from here on out. Another point I want to stress is that I don't want you to spend an hour getting it completely perfect, because when you attach all your gear, it's just going to get thrown off anyway. To be honest, when I'm doing deep space work, I get it fairly close to what the app's telling me, but I don't stress about it because I know it's just going to get thrown off here in a minute. So get it fairly close, and then you can tighten down your clutch. Make sure you do that right now if it was loose. Now we can grab our declination bracket and counterweight kits and get everything attached. All right, so I've got my declination bracket. I'm just gonna slide it down in here. Remember, you want to keep this pretty darn low. That way we get as much leverage out of that counterweight as possible. I'll probably lower mine to right about there, and then we'll tighten it down. Okay, so we're nice and tight there. Now I'll grab my camera and lens, and hopefully I don't drop it again. Another thing you're going to need is that Arca Swiss clamp I mentioned in the counterweight balancing video, which if you haven't watched that video yet, I'd highly recommend you watch it right now. That way you can follow along a little bit easier. So this is that Arca Swiss clamp, and I need to attach it to the screw that comes up through the declination bracket. Now to be safe, I need two hands to do this. I'm actually going to go put the camera back down, install this, and then I'll pick back up with you guys. Okay, so I've attached my Arca Swiss clamp. It's nice and snug. I've got my telephoto lens with the Arca Swiss plate attached. I'm going to slide it in, tighten down the clamp, really make sure that everything's tight. And what do we see? That the camera is shifting left and right, which means my Arca Swiss plate wasn't completely attached. I'm glad I caught that right now. So let me really tighten that down so it doesn't come loose. Do that again. Tighten it down. And there we go. Now one problem I'm having is that when this base fully tightens onto the tripod, all of the weight is right over this area where there's no tripod leg, which means the whole thing could tip over a lot easier compared to if the base was rotated a little bit. That's just to the way that the threading was done. There's nothing I can really do to fix it, unfortunately, that I can think of. So I just want you to be aware of that as well. If your base is kind of hanging over where there's no leg, and you have a really big camera lens, and you didn't have your leg fully extended, and you don't catch it, there's a possibility the whole thing could tip over. So that's why I'm really adamant about making sure all your tripod legs are fully extended. And you should have done all this beforehand. I just wanted to make sure I brought it up right now. But there we go. The scary part's more or less done. We still have to balance it, but the camera is attached, counterweights are attached. Now what we need to do is look back through that polar scope and make sure that the North Star didn't move. And I can almost guarantee you it did move, so we're gonna have to go through and fix it right now. Okay, so we need to redo our polar alignment. And one of the problems you're gonna have is that if you look through the polar scope right now, you might notice that the reticle is no longer lined up. In my case, it's kind of turned crooked, and that's not gonna really help us out. It's gonna make the polar alignment more confusing than it needs to be. So thankfully there's a simple fix. What you wanna do is just loosen your clutch here, firm in on the camera, and then while you're looking through the polar scope, you just want to turn it one way or the other. If you can't see the reticle right now, if it's too dark outside, grab your red headlamp, turn it on, and flash it over the front while you're looking through there to see the reticle. Once you have it lined back up the way it was a minute ago, you can lock it down, your clutch that is. So now that the reticle is back where it needs to be, we can redo our polar alignment. And I'd recommend at this stage you really don't loosen these locks or anything, because the looser this is, the more chance you have for an accident. I want things locked down as tight as possible. And even if they are nice and tight, I can still turn the altitude knob, and it's a very smooth adjustment, even though everything's locked down. Same with our azimuth screws. You should have no trouble turning these. They should be a nice smooth movement left or right. But as you know by now, we're just going to grab our headlamp, flash it over the front to see the reticle briefly, and then we'll make our adjustments. Maybe Polaris needs to go down a little bit, so we'll adjust our knob. I'd also recommend having a hand on the camera, just so that there's no accidents, just to be safe. There we go. Once you have the up and down corrected, you can adjust the left and right, vice versa. Do whatever you have to do until Polaris is right back where it was. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, this seems kind of convoluted. Why didn't we just do the polar alignment with everything attached to begin with? And the reason I don't do that is because when you have all this gear attached, especially your first couple nights out, it makes things much more difficult. And it also stresses you out more because you have all this gear on here. So for me, the easiest way to do it is actually with nothing attached first, like I showed you. Even if we spend a little bit more time, it's better to do it this way. So now that we've attached all our gear again, we're going to double check the alignment. And there we go. So now that we've gotten Polaris back where it needs to be, we can loosen our clutch again, go back to straight, and tighten it down. Now we're ready to move on with the workflow. So far, all we've really done is a polar alignment, but that was a really critical step. At this stage, we need to balance our counterweight in both, well, not necessarily our counterweight, but we have our right ascension axis, remember? And we also have our declination right here. We need to get both of these balanced right now before we get the object centered up and all that. So in my case, I'm going to tighten down the declination knob here, firm hand on the camera or right under it, drop everything horizontally, and then balance things out. As you might have recalled from the counterweight balancing video, I cannot balance this camera and lens with a single counterweight, which is unfortunate. So I need to go grab my ball head, screw it on here, and then we can continue on. Okay, my ball head's attached. Now I can loosen my clutch again, lower it down, and we're pretty much perfectly balanced, so I'm not going to worry about it. Good enough for me. That's our right ascension balance. That's really all we can do right now. At this point, you need to figure out what you want to photograph tonight. You can do maybe the Andromeda Galaxy or the Veil Nebula or the Lagoon Nebula. You've got a lot of different choices depending on the focal length of your lens. Tonight, I'm going to say we're going to do the Andromeda Galaxy. That's one of people's favorite objects. So to find it, I'm going to load up Stellarium on my smartphone. This is one of my recommended apps from the first module of the course. And once you load up Stellarium, there's a lot of different things you could do, but I'm going to click on the 6 boxes in the lower left. That'll kind of bring up all my different settings. From here, I want to verify that the compass is turned on. That way I see my cardinal directions. And then at the top of the window, you should see a search bar. It's kind of hard to see, but if I click up there, I can now enter Andromeda Galaxy. And it's automatically going to move towards the object. If Andromeda is below the horizon, then maybe you're out early springtime or in the middle of the winter, and it's just not up. So this is another thing we talk about in the course, the deep space course, is what time these objects are up. But Andromeda is up pretty much from May until December, really. It's one of the best objects to do year-round. Now that we see Andromeda here on the screen, we need to correlate that with the stars we see up in the sky. That's personally how I find all these objects. So if you were to look closely, you would see 1, 2, 3 bright stars kind of forming a slight arc. If we take the middle of those 3, go up a little bit above it, there's a bright star. In this case, it's labeled like U and if we go that same distance up again, we see the Andromeda Galaxy. Another way to help find it is we have 3 bright stars, 1, 2, 3, in the Milky Way Galaxy. And if you're in a dark sky, you should see all these stars no problem. If you're in a more light polluted area, this will be more challenging. And that's why I always recommend getting out to a darker sky when possible. But going back to those 3 stars in the Milky Way, if we take the top star and the bottom star and kind of make a triangle out from those, that will also point us towards Andromeda. So when I'm out here on location, all I'm doing is looking at the app, looking up to see the stars that match in the app. I'm saying, okay, I see that star there, I see that star there. Let me kind of aim up roughly where I think it's going to be. So I'll loosen my clutch here for my right ascension. I'll also loosen the clutch for the declination. And out here in the dark, it's possible you start unscrewing the wrong one. So always double check you're actually using the right screw here. There we go. Now in my case, if we're pretending I'm facing north, I'm not really right now, but if I was, and we're doing this in the summer months, Andromeda is going to be up over here, roughly. So now that I know that, I need to think about what focal length do I want to shoot it at. And I can tell you, if you're on a full frame camera, 400 millimeters is a great focal length. You could probably push it to 500, but I wouldn't go more than that. If you can only go to like 200 millimeters, that's fine. Just do your maximum focal length here. You want to get a lot of zoom. But in my case, I'm going to go to about 450. And if you have a lens that zooms in and out like this, it's really important that you just pre-zoom it right now, because we're going to balance our declination. So now that I'm aimed up roughly where it needs to be, and I've zoomed in roughly where I think I'm going to be, I'm just going to make sure that my right ascension clutch is loose and let go. And I want to see if the front of the lens pulls down or if the back of the camera pulls down. That'll tell us if we're front heavy or back heavy. In this case, I don't really see it moving, do you? I mean, I think we're pretty good. If I was aimed down there though, watch what happens. The front of the lens is pulling down. So it's really important here that you do aim fairly close to the object that you want to photograph. And that's really what's going to determine your declination balance. So in my case, I don't really have to do anything here. It's already balanced. But just to show you, if I was aimed down here, the lens is front heavy. The way I'm going to fix that is using the Arca Swiss clamp that we talked about in the counterweight balancing video. I'm going to loosen it with a firm hand on my camera, that way it doesn't slide to the ground and break. And if it was front heavy, then I just need to bring the weight backwards. So bring it back there, tighten down the clamp, and then let go. Now it's not moving, which tells me it's balanced. If I went too far though, and I let go, well, let's see. I'm just trying to demo this so you see what I'm talking about. Now the camera's pulling down. That tells me I'm a little bit back heavy. So just continually move things forwards and backwards. Again, you want to be aimed up roughly where the object's at and zoomed into the focal length that you think you're going to be at. And if you let go and nothing moves, you know you're pretty well balanced. So there we go. Now what we can do is zoom out to our widest focal length. That way we have a wider field of view for finding the object. That's going to come in really handy here in a minute. We can also tighten down our clutch. That way the camera doesn't fall. Tighten down this clutch. Just make sure at this point everything is locked down nice and tight. And there we go. Before we continue on, I do have two small points. The first is that if you're out in a very humid environment or on a cold night, you might want to grab your lens hood and attach it right now, because that will help to prevent frost or dew from settling on the front of your lens. It won't completely prevent it, but it should help a little bit. This will also throw off your balancing. So if you do want to attach that lens hood, you will have to rebalance both the right ascension and the declination, so bear that in mind. I'm just going to put mine on tonight, even though I'm out here in the desert. And one other thing that can really help is a laser pointer. Now this is a very bright green laser pointer, so I'm not even going to shine it in the camera. You really got to be careful because you can damage your eyes if you're not, if you point this the wrong way. So be very careful with these, but you can buy them for like 20, 30 bucks usually online if they're legal in your country. This is just an easy way to help you find the object. Personally, I don't need one with a telephoto lens and a DSLR, but this does come in handy with my dedicated Astro camera where I don't even have a view screen on there. So what you would do if you do want to try the laser pointer is just rubber band it around your lens. Probably also help to have the lens hood on just so you have a bigger surface to attach it to. And most importantly, when this is attached, the laser can't be dangling like this, obviously. It has to be the exact same plane as your lenses, otherwise it's completely useless. So sometimes two rubber bands will help just to really lock it on there. But right about there should be right on the money. So I could briefly turn it on, make sure there's no airplanes where you're aiming, and then I can see exactly where I aimed at. Then I can go back to my smartphone app, Stellarium in this case, and say, okay, I see those three bright stars and the three over there. If I turn on my laser, I think I'm pretty close, but let me just double check in the app. If I forget exactly where Andromeda is at here on the phone, I'll click the 6 boxes in the lower left, go up to the search window at the top, type in Andromeda Galaxy, and now I see the little box around it. So just do this. It just takes practice, and again, the darker sky, the better. That way you can see some of the fainter pointer stars. If you're in a light polluted area, good luck, because you're not really going to be able to see much at all. You'll just have to keep taking photos until you see it on the screen. But again, you could briefly turn on the laser pointer, verify where you're aimed at, and just try and get it fairly close. Remember, we zoomed out to 150 millimeters in this case. That way we have a wider field of view. Anyway, once you're fairly close, or you think you're close, now we can turn on the camera and turn on our live view system. One thing I'd really recommend is getting a camera that does have a flip out screen like this. I don't know if you can see it with the camera angle, but that'll save your back, your knees, your neck, just having that screen that flips out like this rather than having to crouch down and look. For me, that's just a killer. So I'm going to turn on my live view system. And then once live view is turned on, this is actually my first time using this camera since it fell. Now that live view is turned on, you should be able to see a bright star somewhere in there if you remember to take off the lens cap, of course. That would screw you up, and that happens all the time. People forget to take this off, so don't do that. But there we go. If you're not seeing anything through live view, one thing I found that would help is actually just turn off the camera completely. Double check that your lens is near infinity focus. That way the stars aren't completely blurred out. And then look through the viewfinder if you have a DSLR. Okay. So now that I'm looking through the viewfinder, I can loosen my big clutch here. And now I'll move my camera while I'm looking through the viewfinder. And I want to see if I can see one of those pointer stars that we've talked about. If I think I'm roughly where I need to be, I can lock down my clutch, turn on the camera again, and now we can start taking our test photos and get the object in the frame. So for our test photos, we want to be on full manual mode, a shutter speed of, it really just depends on the object, but I would say anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds. You don't want to shoot any longer than that, you're just going to be wasting time. In my case, I'll do 10 seconds because Andromeda is so big and bright. Aperture needs to be wide open. And then ISO, that needs to be cranked up. I would say 12,800, if not higher. The higher the ISO, the brighter the image is going to be, and the faster you're going to be able to find these objects. So again, I'm at 10 seconds, ISO 12,800, and I'll just take a photo. Once it's complete, I'll zoom in on my playback screen. Although with Andromeda, you don't need to even zoom in. You'll see it there in the full field of view. If you don't see Andromeda in the screen right now, not a big deal. That happens all the time. So what you want to do now is sometimes even just look over the top of the lens and say, hey, am I actually where I think I am? Or off to the side. You could turn on the laser pointer if you got it. You could turn on live view and see if you see any of the matching stars compared to the app. Just try some different things and verify you're zoomed out all the way. But if you didn't get in the frame, maybe it's too far to the right or the left. So we can loosen our clutch here and maybe turn the camera slightly to the right or the left. Take another photo. If you still don't see it, maybe we're too high or too low. So move it up a little bit. You just got to keep doing this over and over again. Personally, for me, I can almost always get the object on the first try. If not, maybe the second or the third try. Very rarely does it take me longer than that. However, there have been plenty of nights where I've spent over half an hour trying to find the object. Sometimes I never even find it because it's usually like right overhead. And I'm crouching down and it's such a pain. So it's always easier if the object is kind of up at this angle. Just keep all that in mind. Anyway, there's not really much more I could say to this. You just got to keep making small little adjustments, taking a test photo, and seeing if the object's in the frame, regardless of what you're photographing. Eventually you will notice it. At that point, we need to get it centered up. So one of the nice things with the Star Adventurer base is that we have a fine tuning knob over here. So I'm going to change the camera angle, that way I can show you what I'm talking about a little bit better. This is the fine tuning knob I was talking about a minute ago. Basically this just turns a gear and that'll turn this whole piece here 360 degrees. So if you just turn this one way or the other, it's very smoothly going to move your camera. You can think of it left and right basically. That's going to be a very precise way of getting your object centered up. So that's going to be again our kind of left and right. But it might not actually translate to left and right in your field of view because we're at a weird angle. So it does take a lot of practice and quite a bit of time to get the object centered up. So that's how we're going to do our, again, left and right, if you will. To get our up and down, you could loosen the clutch and try and move it very slowly, but that can be hard to do. So one thing that would help is if you use the slewing arrows on the side of your Star Adventurer. Although, to be honest, they don't really work that well because they move so slowly, you might not even realize which direction it's going. And you could hold it down for probably 30 seconds and barely move it. But that's something I'd at least try one night so you get some practice with it. Realistically, if I was doing this, I would just loosen the clutch, try and move it very slightly, tighten it down, and then take another test photo. Again, all we're doing right now is just getting the object centered up at a wide field of view. At this point, I'm assuming you've got the object centered up at your widest focal length. And now we're ready to finally turn on the star tracker if you haven't done so already. You could have done it at any point after you did the counterweight balancing and the polar alignment and all that. I usually just kind of forget. It's not a big deal. But remember, I recommend taking out one of the batteries. That way this thing didn't accidentally turn on in the case. So I'd have to go to my car, grab that AA, pop it in, and then we're going to turn this to the star tracking speed. Put the cover back on, and there we go. Now our tracker is going to be following the motion of the object. Now we need to figure out our camera settings and get everything focused properly, zoom in the focal length we want, and a lot more. As you can see, it's a pretty involved process. First, let's get zoomed into our appropriate focal length. Again, I'm going to go to about 400 millimeters today. Now when I do that, I need to refocus the lens. So I'm going to turn on live view. You should see a bright star somewhere on your live view screen. For those of you with Canon cameras, especially the older DSLRs, good luck. It seems every time I work with a Canon student, we can never see anything through the live view, which is something I hate about those cameras. Nikon and Sony generally tend to fare a lot better, but the new Canon mirrorless are amazing. You can actually see the Milky Way in real time here on the back of the screen on like the EOS R, the RA, etc. Hopefully you can see a bright star here in your live view. They might be very dim though. And another problem is if your focus isn't near infinity, they might be so blurred out, you're not going to see anything anyway. So I would look at your lens and verify that you are pretty close to infinity, just so the stars aren't completely blurred out. While we're talking about the lens, turn off autofocus, turn off vibration control. Those are only going to cause problems. You might have already turned those off, but verify they're turned off right now. Now what I want to do is zoom in real time on live view on a bright star and turn my focusing ring very slowly left and right until that star is as small as possible. If you had a Batinov mask and a telescope, what you'd want to do is get so the lines, the middle line is right in the middle. It's not higher or lower. That is one of the nice things about having the Batinov mask is you can really make sure you've got a perfect focus. You don't need one, but just something to consider down the road. All right, so I'm assuming you've now focused the lens. If you're really having trouble here, one workaround you can try is just taking a photo. But if you take a photo manually like we've been doing, you're going to shake the camera and you're not going to be able to tell if things were properly focused or not. So you're kind of defeating the purpose. With that in mind, you're going to want to grab your remote right now if you haven't already attached it. So let me go grab mine and then we can continue on. Okay, I got my remote. Now I can connect it to the camera. And hopefully you've got a decent remote system here. We talked about this in the gear section of the course, but I'm using the Velo Shutter Boss 2. It's a wired remote, but honestly I think it works better than the wireless because you still have the dongles and everything. So there we go, I got my remote. And now I can just use the big button right here to take a photo. And remember, you do want to be manual mode, 10 seconds, 12,800. We're still at a very high ISO, relatively short shutter speed, just so we're not wasting a lot of time at this stage. Again, the whole thing we're doing now is getting the lens focused without being able to see live view. I might have gotten lost in the weeds there. So I'm going to take my photo and I'm going to check the playback. If the stars are a little bit out of focus, I'm going to very slightly adjust the focus ring one way or the other, take another shot. If the stars look better, I'll keep going in that direction, take another shot. Again, this is just the way you have to do it if you've got a Canon system or you've just got bad eyes and you cannot see anything on the live view screen. That's just kind of the unfortunate workaround. But eventually you're going to get the lens as focused as you think you can get it. I'd recommend you zoom in on your live view though after you've taken the photo and really make sure these stars are sharp, because it's pretty disappointing to spend all this time out here, get back to the computer, and then you realize none of your photos were even that focused. So keep that in mind. But we're going to keep moving right along, that way I don't waste your whole day on this video. And now that we've got the object centered up in the frame and it's focused, we can finally start taking our real photos. So what we want to do now is figure out our maximum shutter speed without star trails. This is going to depend on your polar alignment accuracy, your focal length, how well balanced everything is, and just how well built the star tracker was. There's always a little bit of variance. But this brings me to a really important point, and that is when we are balancing everything, and even just walking around here, it's possible the polar alignment is no longer accurate. So what I'd like everybody to do before you start taking your photos, grab your smartphone, go back to the SAM console app, and Polaris will probably have moved a little bit since we did our initial alignment because we spent so long here. In my case, it has moved probably 5 or 10 minutes on the reticle. So now what I want to do is look through my polar scope. But this brings us back to the problem we talked about earlier. The polar scope reticle is no longer lined up, it's crooked. That's okay, don't worry about it. I don't want you to have to turn everything back that way, because ultimately it doesn't matter what orientation that circle's in. It'll make things easier, but it's not a big deal if it's turned crooked. So what I want you to do is grab your red headlamp, shine it over the front, and make sure Polaris is still on the same spot on the reticle. I don't care that the numbers have turned, as long as it matches what we see in the app. It's on the same spot of the circle. That's all that really matters. More than likely, you will notice that it has drifted very slightly, maybe to the left or right. So now's the time to fix that polar alignment and get it as close as possible, because when we're shooting at 400 millimeters, that alignment's got to be perfect. That might throw off your composition a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. So again, make a small adjustment, flash the red light, get the polar alignment back where it needs to be, and that'll really help you out. So now that we've double checked our alignment, we can finally, again, dial in our camera settings. So we need to find our maximum shutter speed without star trails. And this is, again, dependent on a lot of factors, but I recommend everybody start off at a 30-second long exposure. You should all be able to shoot 30 seconds regardless of the focal length, and as long as you did a decent polar alignment. So I'm going to do 30 seconds. You could probably still leave the ISO pretty high, and then we're going to grab our remote, press the big button to take a photo. Once it's complete, hit the playback, make sure there's no star trails. If there's a lot of star trails, probably because the tracker's not turned on. So make sure you are on the star icon for your tracking speed, and if not, that's your problem. Another issue could be that your dial here for your hemisphere, maybe it's set to time-lapse mode, or it's on S, or something. Just verify you are on the correct hemisphere right now. That would be another reason why you're getting star trails. And then, now that you've checked both of those things, you might also want to look through the polar scope one more time and make sure Polaris is still where it needs to be. Take another 30-second long photo. Once it's complete, look at your playback. There could be a few more reasons why you're getting star trails right now. I'm glad we're going through this. One reason could be you still have vibration control turned on your camera or on the lens. And in fact, I was working with a student, she had an Olympus camera, and because of the Olympus sensor, it was a mirrorless, it was actually causing star trails. I've never seen that before. So that really threw me for a loop. What I'm getting at is that if you have a mirrorless camera, especially an Olympus, make sure you go into your camera's menu system and turn off any kind of image stabilization, because that could actually be causing star trails. Now that we've double checked all the problems, we'll take one more photo at 30 seconds and see if we have trails. If we do, drop it down to 20 seconds and just say, you know what, that's all I'm going to get tonight, our 20-second long exposures. But almost everybody should have no trouble getting 30 seconds. Now that we've done 30, we can try for 45 or maybe a minute, maybe even 2 minutes or longer. So for everybody now, we need to go to bulb mode. For Canon shooters, you might have a B here on your top dial, which stands for bulb. For Nikon and Sony and most other cameras, you need to go past 30 seconds on your shutter speed. Once you go past 30 seconds, it'll now say bulb. And then from here, we could also probably lower the ISO to 6400. That's kind of a good baseline right now. And then finally, we're going to turn on a remote if you haven't done so already. That way we can shoot longer than 30 seconds. Once the remote is turned on, and in my case, I think the battery's finally died on me. Good thing I'm not actually shooting tonight. Yeah, so that's another thing. Make sure you've got fully charged batteries or some spares in the car. But anyway, once the remote was turned on, you would set your, in my case, the terminology is long. It's going to depend on every single remote, but read up on your manual, see what works and what doesn't. Set the shutter speed on your remote though to maybe 1 minute, and then hit the timer start stop button, not the big button here, timer start stop. That will begin your 1 minute long photo. I'd recommend too that you don't leave the camera, or rather the remote, dangling, because this cord dangling here could ruin your exposure. What I like to do is grab a little beer koozie with a safety pin through it, hook that through my tripod hook, and slide it down on in there. There we go. Now I don't have any weight dangling off the side of the camera. I'll take a step back, because even just walking around here, that could be enough to ruin your shot. So I always like to go away from the camera while it's working, but just let it run for a minute. Once it's complete, and you'll hear it click, hit the playback and see if you have star trails. If you do, drop it down to 45 seconds. If things still look good, go to maybe 1:30, maybe even 2 minutes. Just find the maximum shutter speed. You get the idea. And after you find your maximum shutter speed, you can adjust the ISO. That's really when you want to do that. If you noticed your image was too bright, lower the ISO. If the image was too dark, increase the ISO. It's that simple. Some rough guidelines would be ISO 3200 to 6400 if you're between 30 seconds and a minute and in a fairly dark sky. But again, it's really completely dependent on the light pollution, your aperture, the object you're photographing. There's a lot of factors. All I can tell you is if the image is too bright, lower the ISO until it looks okay. If the image is too dark, increase the ISO. That's all there is to it. The only thing left from here is to set up our interval and then go relax while this thing's running. That's pretty much the whole workflow. So on my remote again, I want to go to the interval, and on Nikon cameras and on this remote, my interval is going to be 1 second longer than my shutter speed. So if I was shooting 1 minute long photos, my interval would be 1 minute and 1 second. For some of you on Canon or maybe Fuji, your interval might just be 1 second. So if your shutter speed was 1 minute, your interval would be 1 second. It's either 1 second or 1 second longer than your shutter. Try both, see what works for you. And then you should also put like a self-timer delay on the remote to maybe 5 seconds. That way when you click start, you've got a countdown. You could slide the remote in your koozie or whatever you want to do. Get away from the camera before it starts taking your first exposure. That'll really help you out. And then for the number of photos, that's entirely up to you. The more, the better. I recommend a minimum of 1 hour of exposure time for any object, but if you can do more than an hour, that's always better. So if you were taking 1 minute long photos, you can do 60 of them, and give you an hour. Just do whatever you want to do there for the number of photos. If everything's ready to go, you double check that all the vibration control and autofocus is turned off. Your camera settings are still accurate here. The tracker's turned on, of course. Then we'll hit timer start stop, slide it in, and let it run. We're now doing deep space astrophotography with our Star Adventurer DSLR and telephoto lens. And I'd recommend checking this every 15 to 20 minutes. So if you're out in the winter, you can go in the house and warm up now, or maybe sit in the car. After it's been about 20 minutes though, we're going to come out here, stop the remote, click on our playback, zoom in all the way and verify that there's no trailing and the stars are still focused, or that there's not any dew form on the front of the lens. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So one thing I'd caution you on is that if you're shooting in the winter, your focus ring, it's not really the focus ring, but the lens itself, as the temperature cools down, the lens is going to shrink a little bit. That will ruin your sharp focus. So I can tell you every 15 or 20 minutes in the winter, I come out here, turn on live view and refocus the lens, and then I begin my image sequence again, because it will ruin your night if you don't check for that. Finally, for those of you shooting at 300 millimeters and higher, you might want to consider getting an auto guider. That's going to make this tracker run much more accurately. So rather than shooting 30 seconds or a minute, you could probably shoot 2, 3, maybe even 4 minutes, still with sharp stars. An auto guider can make a massive difference. Now today, as you probably realized, we've gone on way longer than I wanted to, so I'm not going to talk about auto guiders today. There's a full auto guider module here in the course. I'd recommend you go watch through those videos. That'll get you up to speed. But again, for those of you shooting 300 millimeters and up, if you're having trouble with star trails, that auto guider can really help out. And all it is just a little camera. It locks onto a star and it just sends commands to your tracker to say, hey, keep it moving, keep it moving. That way it doesn't slow down or speed up or anything. And what it translates to is you can just shoot longer shutter speeds without star trails. Well, hopefully you didn't fall asleep through that tutorial and you learned a lot. The biggest thing with deep space is that you just go out and practice as much as you can, and also get out to a darker sky whenever possible. As we talked about in the light pollution video, even driving 20 minutes can have a huge impact on your ability to see the stars and cut down on the light pollution. You can also consider getting some filters, but if anything, I think the filters will hurt you if you're a beginner, because it's going to make finding and focusing on your object much more difficult. So again, getting out to those darker skies will help you out. But that's how you're going to do deep space astrophotography with your Star Adventurer. And you can apply these concepts to whatever object you want to photograph. But if you really want to learn more, again, I did make a complete follow-up course called my Deep Space course, over 15 hours of new content. and we'll get into even more detail. So if you're still struggling with this after a couple weeks or months, you might want to consider that. But that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys probably next in the post-processing videos.